Hey, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we're diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery, smart, sharp, and worth every minute. The morning Cecilia Hartwell walked into Nero Wolfe's brownstone on West 35th Street. I was at my desk in the office, trying to balance a checkbook that refused to be balanced, and drinking coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. It was the kind of Tuesday that makes you wonder why Tuesday was ever invented. Outside, November was doing its best impression of a personal grudge. Gray sky, mean wind off the Hudson, and a particular kind of cold that gets into your collar and stays there. Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms. He goes up every morning at 9 and stays until 11, communing with his 10,000 orchids, as though the rest of the world is a minor inconvenience scheduled for later. I'd been his confidential assistant, legman, errand boy, and occasional conscience for going on 14 years, and I had long since stopped expecting him to alter this routine for anything short of a federal subpoena, and even then he'd argue about it. So when Fritz came to the office doorway and told me there was a woman in the front hall who looked like she hadn't slept in 3 days and was holding a manila envelope the way a drowning woman holds a life preserver, I handled it myself. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, which she wore well. Dark hair with distinguished threads of silver at the temples, good cheekbones, the kind of posture that suggests either excellent schooling or a great deal of suppressed anxiety. She had on a charcoal wool coat that cost money, and brown eyes that had recently been crying and were now pretending they hadn't. The manila envelope was pressed against her chest like a shield. "Mr. Goodwin?" she said. "Last time I checked," I said, and offered her my hand and then the red leather chair across from Wolfe's desk. She took both. I settled into my own chair and picked up my pen, more out of habit than necessity. "Mr. Wolfe won't be available until 11. If you'd like to tell me what's brought you here, I can decide whether it's worth interrupting his schedule." She placed the envelope on the edge of the desk with a precision that told me she'd been rehearsing this moment. "My name is Cecilia Hartwell. My brother, Edmund Hartwell, died 6 days ago. The police have closed the matter as a heart attack. He was 51 years old and had the cardiovascular profile of a man of 35. His cardiologist told me as much at the funeral." She paused. "I believe Edmund was murdered, and I believe the instrument of his murder was a document he signed, or rather, a document someone signed for him." I kept my face professionally neutral, which takes practice. "That's a specific theory," I said. "I'm a specific person," she replied. That, I thought, was going to go over well with Wolfe. He has a deep and abiding respect for precision in a client, almost as deep as his contempt for clients who waste his time with vague intuitions dressed up as facts. I looked at the envelope. "What's in there?" "A copy of a contract, or what purports to be a contract, signed by my brother 3 weeks before his death, transferring his 40% stake in Hartwell and Crane Publishing to his business partner, Douglas Crane, for $1 and other considerations." She said it with the flatness of someone who has repeated an outrage so many times it has begun to sound almost mundane. Edmund would sooner have transferred his own skeleton. "You've had a lawyer look at it?" "3 lawyers. All 3 say the signature is Edmund's. One of them was Edmund's own attorney of 20 years, a man named Gerald Foss, who claims he witnessed the signing personally." She paused again. "Gerald Foss is also, as of last week, on retainer with Douglas Crane." I wrote the names down. Edmund Hartwell, Douglas Crane, Gerald Foss, Cecilia Hartwell. Even on paper they had the makings of a story. The kind of story where somebody ends up dead, and the paperwork is worse than the corpse. "Anyone else I should know about?" I asked. She thought about it. "There's Vivian Crane, Douglas's wife. She and Edmund had a complicated history, which is the most diplomatic way I can phrase it. There's also a man named Peter Ashby, who was Edmund's editorial director and his closest friend at the firm. And there's a young woman, Sylvie Marchand. She was Edmund's personal assistant for the last 2 years. She's the one who first told me about the contract." "She told you about it, not your brother?" Edmund didn't tell me about it. A flicker of something crossed her face. Not quite grief, not quite anger, but somewhere in that unhappy neighborhood. That, Mr. Goodwin, is perhaps the clearest evidence that something is wrong. Edmund told me everything. We had lunch every Sunday for 31 years. He told me when he had his first drink at the age of 14, when he made his first bad business deal at 23, and when he fell in love with a married woman at 40. He would never in this life or any conceivable other have signed away his life's work without telling me. I was inclined to believe her, which is not always a reliable instinct, but is a useful data point. What do you want Wolfe to do? I asked. I want him to find out who forged that signature and prove that my brother was murdered. She said it simply, without melodrama. I understand his fee is substantial. I have the means to pay it. The fee, I said, is the least complicated part of this. The complicated part is that Wolfe doesn't enjoy leaving this house, doesn't enjoy being rushed, doesn't enjoy clients who withhold information, and doesn't enjoy working on cases where the police have officially closed the matter, because it means they'll be uncooperative when he proves them wrong, which he will, if you're telling me the truth. Those are the terms. Still interested? She met my eyes steadily. I have been interested since the morning I stood at my brother's graveside and watched Douglas Crane cry tears that did not reach his eyes, she said. Yes, I'm still interested. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 10:47. Then you can tell it to him yourself, in 13 minutes. Fritz will bring you coffee. Wolfe came down from the plant rooms at 11 on the dot, as he always does, wearing his canary yellow shirt and the expression of a man who has been having a perfectly satisfactory morning and is now prepared to be mildly disappointed by the human race. He is 6 feet tall, and so close to 1/7 of a ton that the distinction is academic. He moves, nonetheless, with the particular deliberateness of a man who is always exactly where he intends to be. He saw Cecilia Hartwell in the red leather chair, registered her with a glance so swift it might have passed for indifference, and settled himself into his reinforced chair behind the desk. He pressed the button that summons Fritz, received his first glass of beer of the morning, took a sip, and set the glass down on the coaster. "Miss Hartwell," he said, not a question. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "Archie tells me your brother has died, and you believe he was murdered through the mechanism of a fraudulent legal document." He said it the way another man might read a grocery list, systematically, without emotion, to establish that the items are present and accounted for. "Tell me about your brother." She told him. She was good at it. Organized, detailed, unsentimental. Edmund Hartwell, born 1973 in Westchester, educated at Columbia, had co-founded Hartwell and Crane Publishing with Douglas Crane in 2001 with borrowed money and a shared conviction that the literary world was underserved by its existing infrastructure. The firm had grown steadily, now published 60 titles a year, and was valued by most industry estimates at somewhere between $40 and $60 million. Edmund owned 40%. Douglas Crane owned 40%. The remaining 20% was divided among a small group of early investors who had largely cashed out their operational involvement years ago. "The contract," Wolfe said, when she reached that part. She slid the envelope across the desk. Wolfe did not touch it immediately. He looked at it, then at her. "You said, Archie, that 3 attorneys had examined the signature and found it genuine. They found it consistent with Edmund's signature." "Yes." "And Gerald Foss, the witness, claims to have been present at the signing." "He does." "Where was the signing alleged to have taken place?" "At the firm's offices on Madison Avenue, according to Foss, on the afternoon of October 14th, a Thursday." "And where was your brother on the afternoon of October 14th? Cecilia Hartwell's composure shifted, by about a millimeter. "That," she said, "is one of the things I don't know. I only learned of the contract's existence after Edmund's death, from Sylvie Marchand. Edmund's calendar for that day, which Sylvie maintains, shows no such meeting." Wolfe picked up the envelope then, extracted the document, and read it with the focused attention he brings to everything that interests him, which meant his eyes moved down the page once, and he set it face down on the desk. I've seen him read faster than most people skim. He poured another inch of beer. The signature, he said. Describe it to me. Your brother's habitual signature. She frowned slightly. It was very distinctive. He used an old-fashioned style. He was taught penmanship by a demanding uncle in the 80s. A sweeping capital E with 3 connected horizontal strokes, and the H of Hartwell written in a single continuous line without lifting the pen. I would know it anywhere. And the signature on this document? A pause of approximately 2 seconds. Looks like his signature, she said carefully. But I cannot say I am certain it is. Yet 3 lawyers and his attorney of 20 years say that it is. Yes. Wolfe set his beer down. He laced his fingers over his middle mound, stared at the ceiling for a moment, and then looked at Cecilia Hartwell with an expression I've learned to read as the one that means a case has passed from possible to interesting. Your brother's death, he said. The medical examiner's conclusion was myocardial infarction? Yes, he was found in his apartment on the morning of November 4th by his housekeeper. He had been dead for several hours. The medical examiner found no signs of trauma and noted a slightly elevated potassium level, which was deemed consistent with the natural processes following death. I kept my face where it was, which required modest effort. Elevated potassium was the kind of detail that most clients wouldn't know and fewer would think to mention. This one had done her homework. Wolfe's fingers tightened fractionally against each other. Potassium chloride, he said, to no one in particular, administered in sufficient quantity, induces cardiac arrest and is virtually undetectable in postmortem analysis unless specifically tested for, because potassium levels rise naturally after death. The medical examiner would have to be specifically looking for it. He focused on Cecilia Hartwell again. Did you request that the medical examiner's office conduct additional toxicological testing? I was told the case was closed, and that additional testing would require a court order, which would require evidence of foul play. A circular problem, since the only way to obtain the evidence is to conduct the test. Indeed. Wolfe picked up the document again and looked at the signature. You are not paying me to exhume your brother, Miss Hartwell. You are paying me to establish that a fraud was committed, which will create sufficient basis for the authorities to reconsider the matter of his death. That is a more tractable problem. He set the paper down. My fee for this investigation will be $100,000 against expenses. Half now, half upon conclusion. Cecilia Hartwell did not flinch. She reached into her bag and produced a checkbook. To whom do I make it payable? Nero Wolfe, I said helpfully. She wrote the check and slid it across the desk. Wolfe left it where it was, which is his habit. He doesn't look at checks while clients are present, on the theory that it's D-Class A. I'll need to speak with each of the individuals you've mentioned, Wolfe said. Douglas Crane, Gerald Foss, Peter Ashby, and Sylvie Marchand. I will not go to them, they will come here. Archie will make the arrangements. And if they refuse? Wolfe's expression registered the question as mildly unworthy. People rarely refuse an invitation to discuss a matter in which they have an interest, he said. Those with a guilty interest will come because they want to know what I know. Those with an innocent interest will come because they want justice. The only variety of person who refuses is one with a guilty interest and more confidence in their own cunning than the situation merits. Should any of your suspects fall into that category, we will adjust our approach. He paused. One more question. Yes? Did your brother have a will? He did. Executed 5 years ago. His estate, aside from the publishing stake, which the contract ostensibly transferred before his death, is divided between several charitable foundations and a trust for the children of his first marriage. I am not a beneficiary. I have money of my own. I wasn't suggesting a motive, Wolfe said mildly. I was establishing the landscape. He reached for his beer. That will be all for now, Miss Hartwell. Archie will see you out and call you this afternoon. She rose, shook my hand with a grip that meant something, and was gone. Fritz had her coat at the door before she reached the hall, because Fritz has been anticipating people's needs in that brownstone since before I arrived, and will likely continue doing so long after I'm gone. I came back to the office and stood in front of Wolfe's desk. He was looking at the check, which he now felt was appropriate to examine. "Potassium chloride," I said. "It is a hypothesis," he said, "one of several." "The signature bothers you." He looked up. "The signature bothers her. What bothers me is the witness, Gerald Foss, a man of 20 years' professional relationship with the deceased, who has subsequently accepted a retainer from the party that most benefits from the document he witnessed." He set the check down. "That is either the most brazen conflict of interest in the history of Manhattan law, or it is the most incautious behavior by a guilty man I have encountered in some time. In my experience, the two possibilities are not mutually exclusive." "You want me to start with Foss?" "I want you to start with Douglas Crane," Wolfe said. "The man who wept without tears at a funeral is a man carrying a weight that is pressing on him. People carrying great weights make mistakes when pressure is applied. I want to apply some." He reached for the document again. "Call him this afternoon. Tell him Nero Wolfe would like his assistance in a matter concerning the estate of Edmund Hartwell. Tell him nothing else. And if he asks what matter," Wolfe's lips moved in the direction of a smile, without quite arriving there. "Tell him it concerns a signature," he said. And observe his response very carefully. I said I would. I was already looking forward to it. In 14 years of working for Nero Wolfe, I have learned that the moment a case acquires a forged signature, a convenient death, and a lawyer who changes sides, it has most of the ingredients for the kind of unpleasantness that keeps detectives employed and the population of Manhattan in a state of productive anxiety. I picked up the phone. Outside, the November wind found a new angle of attack against the brownstone windows, rattled them once as if to announce itself, and settled in for the duration. So did we. I reached Douglas Crane at his office on Madison Avenue at 12 minutes past noon. His assistant, a young man with the clipped efficiency of someone paid to be a human firewall, told me Mr. Crane was unavailable. I told him to tell Mr. Crane that Nero Wolfe was looking into the estate of Edmund Hartwell and had some questions about a signature on a contract dated October 14th. There was a pause of approximately 40 seconds, during which I imagined the message being relayed, received, and processed by a man who knew exactly which signature I meant. Douglas Crane came on the line himself. "Mr. Goodwin," he said. His voice was a good voice, the kind that gets cultivated at certain schools and polished at certain clubs, smooth as good bourbon and about as reliable. "I'm not sure I understand why Nero Wolfe is involved in Edmund's estate. That's a matter for the attorneys." "Mr. Wolfe would be happy to explain his interest in person," I said. "He's available tomorrow morning at 11 or tomorrow afternoon at 3. Which suits you better?" A pause, not long enough to be suspicious, but long enough to be deliberate. "Tomorrow at 11, he said. "But I should tell you, Mr. Goodwin, I don't want to waste time." "Goodwin, then I've already spoken with the family's representatives and cooperated fully with every reasonable inquiry. I want Edmund's affairs settled properly. He was my partner for over 20 years. "That's very cooperative of you," I said warmly. "We'll see you tomorrow at 11. I hung up and called Gerald Foss next. His assistant was a woman, older, with a voice like she'd been answering phones since the Eisenhower administration, and found the experience broadly disappointing. When I gave her Wolfe's name and the subject of the call, she put me on hold without a word. Foss took 3 minutes. When he came on, he was careful in the way that lawyers are careful. Every word placed like a foot on uncertain ice. "Mr. Goodwin, I've already provided a sworn statement regarding the October 14th signing. I'm not sure what additional information Mr. Wolfe believes I can offer." "Mr. Wolfe believes conversation is frequently more illuminating than sworn statements," I said pleasantly. He'd like to talk with you Thursday at 11, if that's convenient. I'll have to check my schedule. Please do. If Thursday doesn't work, we can discuss alternatives. Though Mr. Wolfe did ask me to mention that the matter may become a good deal more public before it becomes more private, and he thought you'd prefer to speak with him before that happened. There was a silence on the line that had a different quality than Crane's silence. Crane's had been calculating. Foss's was something closer to afraid. Thursday at 11, he said finally. I'll be there. 2 down. I called Peter Ashby at the Hartwell and Crane offices, and found him not only willing, but eager. He asked 3 questions before I'd finished my second sentence, and all 3 of them were good questions. He'd come Wednesday at 2. Sylvie Marchand reached on her cell phone, agreed to come Wednesday at 4, with a breathless nervousness that made me wonder whether she was frightened or simply the kind of person who treats all appointments with equal alarm. That left Vivian Crane. Cecilia Hartwell had described her as having a complicated history with Edmund, which was the kind of phrase that contains a novel's worth of information without actually releasing any of it. I called the number Cecilia had provided and reached Vivian Crane directly. No assistant, no firewall, just a woman who answered her own phone on the second ring. Her voice was the opposite of her husband's. Where Douglas was polished, Vivian was raw. Not rough, but unguarded, as if she'd decided some time ago that social performance was more trouble than it was worth. Nero Wolfe, she said, when I explained the call. I know who he is. When does he want to see me? Friday at 11, if that suits. It suits, she said. And then, after a pause that felt less like calculation and more like genuine feeling finding its footing, did Cecilia hire him? Ms. Hartwell is our client, yes. Good, Vivian Crane said, with a conviction that struck me as either the most forthright thing a potential suspect had ever said to me, or the most carefully constructed piece of misdirection. I'll be there Friday. I hung up and reported to Wolfe, who had spent the intervening hour reading a book about Byzantine economic policy and eating the lunch Fritz had prepared, which on that Tuesday involved a veal dish with a sauce that had been simmering since morning and made the office smell like the best restaurant in a city that doesn't exist. Wolfe listened to my summary without looking up from his book. Good, he said. Now go to the Hartwell and Crane offices this afternoon and look at whatever they'll let you look at. I want the texture of the place, the atmosphere, the relationships, the recent history. A publishing house is a small world. Small worlds have long memories and thin walls. So I went. Hartwell and Crane occupied the 14th floor of a building on Madison in the upper 40s. One of those mid-century buildings that has good bones and a lobby that was renovated in the 90s and has been quietly regretting it ever since. The receptionist was a young woman named Maya, who had the polished wariness of someone accustomed to literary agents showing up unannounced. I gave her my card, explained that I was investigating a matter related to Edmund Hartwell's estate, and asked whether anyone might have a few minutes for an informal conversation. She made 3 calls. The third one worked. Peter Ashby met me in the small conference room off the main hallway, the one with the window that looked north over the midtown roofline and the walls lined with framed book covers, the collective output of 23 years of Hartwell and Crane's existence. He was a lean man in his early 50s, angular in the way of people who have always been angular and have made their peace with it. He wore a dark blazer over a dark turtleneck and had the distracted intensity of someone whose mind operates on several tracks simultaneously, and is always slightly impatient with conversations that only run on one. He shook my hand firmly and sat down across from me without waiting to be asked. "You're Wolfe's man," he said. It wasn't a question. "Archie Goodwin," I confirmed. "You knew Edmund Hartwell well. Better than anyone in this building. Better than Douglas, for what that's worth, which lately is not much." He said it without particular heat, which made it more convincing than if he'd said it with bitterness. Edmund and I came up together. I was his first editorial hire, January of 2002. We've worked together for 23 years. "Tell me about the last few months," before his death. Ashby's eyes went briefly to the window, then came back. Edmund was worried. He'd been worried since sometime in the summer, July, August. He didn't talk about it directly, which wasn't like him. Edmund was a talker. He processed things out loud. When he went quiet, it meant something was wrong that he didn't know how to say. Did you ask him about it? Twice. The first time, in September, he said it was a business matter, and he was handling it. The second time, about 2 weeks before he died, he said, Ashby stopped. He pressed his lips together, and for just a moment the angular, focused professional receded, and there was a man underneath who was still absorbing the fact that someone he'd known for more than 2 decades was gone. He said, Pete, if anything happens to me, make sure Cecilia gets everything that's mine. I thought he was being morbid. I told him to stop being morbid. I let that sit for a moment before I spoke again. The contract, the one that transferred his share to Douglas Crane. When did you first hear about it? Sylvie told me, the day after Edmund's funeral. She came to my office and closed the door, which she almost never does, and showed me a copy she'd printed from the firm's document system. His jaw tightened. I want to be precise about my reaction when I say that I have never in my life read a document that made me feel as physically ill as that one did. Not because of what it said, because of what it would have meant about Edmund if it were genuine. He paused. Edmund would not have signed that contract, not for any consideration, not under any circumstances. This firm was his creation. It was the thing he was most proud of in his life, more than his books, more than his children. God help him. He would have burned it to the ground before he handed Douglas Crane a controlling interest. That's a strong statement, I said. It's an accurate one. You want to know what Douglas Crane has done for this firm in the last 5 years? I can tell you in one word. Nothing. Edmund found the books, built the relationships, kept the authors, managed the editorial vision. Douglas managed the business side, which means he went to lunches and signed checks and took credit for decisions Edmund made. He caught himself. I'm not objective about this. I'm aware of that. Being not objective and being wrong are different things, I said. Can you think of anyone who would have had both the access and the ability to forge Edmund's signature? He looked at me steadily. I can think of one person who would have had a compelling reason to try, he said. But I'd rather not say it to you in a room without Nero Wolfe present. Whatever I say to him is going to matter. I want to say it right. I respected that. I thanked him and said we'd see him the next afternoon. Sylvie Marchand was 29, French by extraction and New Jersey by upbringing, with dark eyes that moved quickly and hands that didn't quite stay still. She had the look of someone who has been living on insufficient sleep and excessive coffee and is beginning to develop a complicated relationship with both. She was still at her desk when I found her, Edmund Hartwell's former desk, now technically unoccupied, though from the state of the papers on it, Sylvie hadn't received that memo. She answered my questions with the accuracy of someone who has trained themselves to observe. Edmund had been in the office on October 14th, she said, until approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. She knew because she kept his calendar and had scheduled a 2 o'clock call that ran long. After the call, Edmund had told her he was going out for a walk. He did this when he needed to think, and that she should cancel his 4 o'clock. Did he say where he was going? I asked. No. He just said a walk. He had his coat and he had his phone. He came back around 4:15. She hesitated. He seemed different when he came back. Different how? She searched for the word with the care of someone who wants to be precise. Contained, she said finally. Like something had happened, that he was fitting into a box and closing the lid on. Edmund was expressive. His face told you things, always. When he came back that afternoon, his face wasn't telling me anything. He went into his office, closed the door, and 20 minutes later he came out and said he was done for the day and going home. She paused. He stopped in the doorway on his way out and looked back at me. He said, Sylvie, you're a good egg. Just like that. "You're a good egg." I remember thinking it was an odd thing to say. I thought it was an odd thing to say too. It was the kind of thing you say to someone when you're not sure you'll see them again, and you want to leave them with something. "What time does the firm's document system show the contract was signed?" I asked. She knew the answer immediately. 3:47 p.m., she said, on October 14th, which put Edmund Hartwell somewhere between the walk he took at 2:30 and the return to the office at 4:15, a window of just over an hour and a half, at a supposed signing that his assistant had no record of and that he never mentioned to her or to his sister. "One more question," I said. "The contract in the system, who uploaded it?" Her hands stilled for the first time since I'd sat down. "It was uploaded under Douglas Crane's administrative credentials," she said quietly. I checked. I was back at the brownstone by 5:30. Wolfe was in the office, a fresh beer at his elbow and a new book in his hands. This one about the culinary history of medieval France, which told me his mind was working on the case, and the book was a comfortable noise to think beside. I gave him the full report, delivered from my notes in the methodical order he prefers, with my personal observations held until the end. He listened without interrupting, which is either a compliment to the quality of the information, or a sign that he's thinking so hard he can't spare the energy for questions. With Wolfe, it's usually both. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. The brownstone settled around us, the way old buildings do in November. A creak in the wall, the distant rattle of the heating system, the muffled sound of Fritz preparing dinner in the kitchen. "Between 2:30 and 4:15, Wolfe said, "Edmund Hartwell was somewhere in Manhattan. And between 3:30 and 4, if the document timestamp is accurate, his signature appears on a contract that transferred his life's work to a man he apparently did not trust." He paused, and when he returned to his office, he told his assistant she was a good egg. "That's the shape of it," I said. "The contract was uploaded under Crane's credentials," Wolfe said. "That is either incriminating or theatrical." Meaning someone might have used Crane's credentials to set him up. It is a possibility we cannot dismiss. He turned a page of his book without looking at it. "What is your impression of Peter Ashby?" "Genuine," I said. "Angry, but the clean kind of angry. The kind that comes from watching something unjust happen to someone you cared about. Not the kind that comes from something personal." "And the Marchand woman?" "Scared," I said. "But scared in a specific direction, like she knows something that she's been calculating whether to tell." "She'll tell it to me," Wolfe said, without particular arrogance. It was simply a statement of operational expectation, and in 14 years, he had rarely been wrong about it. Tomorrow will be instructive. He picked up his beer. I picked up my notepad and added 3 items to the list of things that didn't fit. Edmund Hartwell, on the afternoon of October 14th, walked out of his office alone and came back an hour and 45 minutes later, looking like a man who had closed a lid on something. A contract bearing his signature was uploaded to the firm's system at 3:47 that afternoon, under the credentials of the man who most benefited from it. 3 weeks later, Edmund Hartwell told his sister to take care of herself, told his editorial director to make sure she got what was his, and died of a heart attack that nobody had seen coming, and the medical examiner hadn't looked at closely enough. I underlined that last one twice. Outside, the November dark had come down over 35th Street. Inside, Fritz was making something with duck that smelled like an argument for the existence of civilization. Tomorrow, Douglas Crane was coming to the brownstone. I was looking forward to it. Wednesday morning arrived with the particular briskness of a New York November that has decided to stop being polite about itself. I was up at 7:30, which gave me time to review my notes from the previous day, consume 2 cups of Fritz's coffee, and a plate of eggs that constituted a minor argument for never eating breakfast anywhere else, and make 2 phone calls before Wolfe came down from the plant rooms at 11. The first call was to Saul Panzer. If you've spent any time around Nero Wolfe's operation, you know Saul. He's the best freelance operative in the city, possibly in the country, though he'd be the last person to tell you so. He's a small man with an unremarkable face that people consistently fail to remember, which is the single most professionally useful quality an investigator can possess. He charges accordingly, and Wolfe considers him worth every cent, which from Wolfe is the equivalent of a ticker tape parade. I asked Saul to spend the day looking into Douglas Crane, financial records, recent activity, anything that suggested unusual movement of money or unusual nervousness about money. I also asked him to find out where Gerald Foss had been between August and November, whether his practice had taken on any significant new clients, and whether his billing records showed any anomalies. Saul said he'd have something by evening, and hung up before I could say thank you, which is also a Saul characteristic. The second call was to Lieutenant Rawcliffe at the NYPD, which I make only when absolutely necessary, and always with the resigned acceptance of a man who is about to be condescended to by someone with less intelligence and more authority. Rawcliffe and I have a relationship built on mutual professional necessity and mutual personal dislike, which functions adequately as long as neither of us forgets which element is which. I asked him about the Edmund Hartwell case. He told me it was closed. I asked whether the medical examiner's office had conducted a full toxicological panel. He told me the preliminary results showed natural causes. I asked whether potassium levels had been specifically evaluated against ante-mortem baseline. There was a pause that told me he was writing something down while pretending not to. "That's a specific question for a closed case," he said. "Mr. Wolfe has a specific mind. If it turns out the case ought not to be closed, you'll want to have been helpful early in the process." He didn't like that. He rarely likes anything I say, which is one of the few consistent pleasures of our professional relationship. But he said he'd check with the ME's office and call me back, which was more than I'd expected. Peter Ashby arrived at 2 o'clock in the afternoon with the punctuality of a man who respects other people's time because he respects his own. Fretz brought him to the office, where Wolfe was in his chair with a glass of beer, and the settled air of a man receiving a guest on his own terms. Wolfe sized Ashby up in the first 10 seconds. I know his tells by now. The slight focusing of the eyes, the infinitesimal tilt of the head, and apparently approved of what he found, because he skipped the preliminary courtesies that he inflicts on witnesses he finds tiresome, and went directly to substance. "Mr. Ashby, you told my associate yesterday that you could identify a person with both the access and the ability to forge Edmund Hartwell's signature, but that you preferred to say it in my presence. Say it now." Ashby didn't blink. He'd come prepared for directness. "Gerald Foss," he said, "Edmund's attorney. Edmund signed everything, contracts, letters, legal documents, through Foss's office for the last 15 years. Foss had hundreds of samples of Edmund's signature. He also had, as attorneys sometimes do, the relationship with his client that makes intimate knowledge of handwriting a natural byproduct of years of professional proximity." He paused. "And Foss witnessed the contract." "Which makes him either a forger or a fool," Wolfe said. "A man who forged a signature and then served as witness to its authenticity would be both bold and reckless. What do you know of his character?" "Gerald Foss," Ashby said carefully, "is a man who has spent 30 years being the most cautious person in any room he enters. He measures everything. He weighs everything. He does not act impulsively, which means that if he participated in what I think he participated in, he believed the risk was manageable, that he was protected. Protected by whom? By Douglas Crane, who now controls 60% of a firm valued at $50 million, and who has retained Foss at what I understand to be a very generous monthly rate." He said it without triumph, the way you state a fact that gives you no pleasure. "I've known Douglas for 20 years. I don't enjoy saying this." "Did you like him?" I asked from my corner. Wolfe glanced at me with the expression that means he was going to ask the same thing, and is marginally annoyed I got there first. Ashby thought about it. "I respected his business acumen early on," he said. He built the distribution infrastructure that made the firm viable in its first 3 years. Without Douglas's operational mind, Edmund's editorial vision would have died in a warehouse in New Jersey. He paused. But he changed. Slowly, then more quickly. Over the last 5 years, as the firm became valuable in ways he hadn't anticipated, Douglas became a different person than the one who started it. The ambition shifted, became harder, more exclusive. Exclusive, Wolfe said. He wanted what Edmund had built, Ashby said. Not as a partner, as an owner. Wolfe poured beer into his glass, with the deliberate attention he gives to small actions when his mind is engaged with larger ones. "Tell me about October 14th, Wolfe said. Your own movements that day." Ashby nodded, as if he'd expected the question. "I was in the office until approximately 3 o'clock. I had a manuscript meeting in the morning and an author lunch that ran late. I came back to the office around 2:45. I saw Edmund briefly. He was putting on his coat. We exchanged about 6 words. I was in my office from 3 o'clock until I left at 6. My assistant can confirm it." "Did you see Douglas Crane that afternoon?" "I saw him in the morning, not afternoon." He paused. "I should tell you something I didn't tell Archie yesterday, because I wanted to say it here, where it would be recorded properly." He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and produced an envelope, folded once. 3 weeks before Edmund died, he gave me this. He said to open it if anything happened to him. He said he hoped I'd never need to." He placed it on the desk. Wolfe looked at it without touching it for a moment that stretched past comfortable. "You opened it," Wolfe said. "After his funeral, yes. And you've brought it to me rather than the police." "Because the police closed the case," Ashby said, "and because Edmund trusted me to use judgment." Wolfe picked up the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, covered in handwriting I hadn't seen before. Flowing, old-fashioned, with a capital E of 3 connected horizontal strokes, and an H written in one continuous line without lifting the pen. Edmund Hartwell's genuine signature, and above it, 2 short paragraphs in the same hand. Wolfe read it twice. Then he handed it to me. The first paragraph read, "If you are reading this, something has gone wrong that I was not able to prevent. I want it on record that I have not at any point voluntarily agreed to transfer, sell, assign, or otherwise relinquish my ownership stake in Hartwell and Crane Publishing. Any document purporting to reflect such an agreement is fraudulent. I state this of my own free will and in full possession of my faculties. I know what Douglas intends. I have known since August. I have been trying to find a way out of it that does not destroy what we built together. I may have run out of time." October 14th. I looked at Wolfe. He was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man assembling a structure from components he has been collecting patiently, and is now beginning to see whole. "He wrote this on the same day the contract bears his signature," I said. "Yes," Wolfe said, "which means either he wrote it before the signing as a precaution, or after," Wolfe said, "as a repudiation." The room sat with that for a moment. "There's a third possibility," Ashby said quietly. "He wrote it because he knew the signing was going to be attributed to him, and he had not signed. He wrote it because he knew what was coming, and he wanted a record of the truth, before it was buried under whatever Douglas was planning." Wolfe set his beer down. "Mr. Ashby," he said, "Edmund Hartwell entrusted this document to you, which suggests he trusted your discretion. He also suggested, in the document itself, that he knew what Douglas Crane intended. Did he give you any indication of what specifically he believed Crane was planning?" Ashby pressed his lips together. "Not directly, but in September, I think it was the second week, around the 12th or 13th, Edmund came into my office and closed the door and asked me a question that I've been turning over ever since. He asked whether I thought it was possible to make a heart attack look like a natural death without it being detectable. The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. This one had weight. He asked it casually, Ashby continued, the way you might ask whether a plot device in a manuscript was medically plausible. We get those questions from authors sometimes. So I answered it the same way. I said I thought I'd read something about potassium compounds, but that I wasn't a doctor. He nodded and changed the subject. He paused. I didn't connect it to anything at the time. God help me, I didn't connect it. Wolfe said nothing. He picked up his beer, drank, and set it down. One more question, he said. The letter is dated October 14th. What time does the notation at the top indicate? Ashby looked at it. I looked at it. In the upper right corner, Edmund Hartwell had written the date and below it a time, 4:47 p.m., which was 32 minutes after he had returned to the office, looking like a man who had closed a lid on something, and which was, by Sylvie Marchand's account, approximately the time he had gathered his coat, told her she was a good egg, and gone home. He had come back from wherever he'd been, wherever Douglas Crane or Gerald Foss or someone had taken him, or lured him, or cornered him, and he had sat at his desk and written the truth in his own unmistakable hand, because it was the only weapon he had left. 3 weeks later, he was dead. Sylvie Marchand arrived at 4 o'clock and spent 40 minutes in the red leather chair, confirming, with precision and visible distress, everything she had told me the previous afternoon, plus several things she hadn't. The most important of them was this. On the morning of October 15th, the day after the contract was supposedly signed, she had arrived at the office at 8:30 and found Douglas Crane already at Edmund's desk, not his own desk. He had told her he was looking for a file. She had noticed that Edmund's top right drawer, which Edmund kept locked, and which contained, among other things, a personal journal he'd kept for 30 years, was open. Was the journal there? Wolfe asked. No, she said. I noticed because I'd seen it there the previous afternoon when I brought Edmund his messages. It was a green leather journal, very distinctive. It wasn't there the next morning. Did you ask Crane about it? I asked him if he'd seen Mr. Hartwell's green journal. He said he didn't know what I was talking about. He said it very smoothly. She paused. Too smoothly, like he'd prepared for the question. Wolfe nodded once, which for him constitutes enthusiastic acknowledgement. Did Edmund Hartwell's journal ever reappear? No. Have you told the police this? The police, she said, with a flatness that contained a great deal of history, told me that Mr. Hartwell died of a heart attack, and that his partner had every right to be in the office, managing the firm's affairs. They were not incorrect on the second point, Wolfe said. They may yet prove to have been significantly incorrect on the first. He paused. Ms. Marchand, I want you to think carefully before you answer this question. In the 2 years you worked for Edmund Hartwell, did you ever observe any communication between him and Douglas Crane that suggested Crane was aware Edmund suspected him of planning something? She thought about it for a long time. Outside the afternoon had gone gray and close, the sky the color of old pewter. There was one thing, she said. About 6 weeks before Edmund died. I was outside his office. The door was almost closed, not quite. Edmund and Douglas were inside. I heard Douglas say, very quietly, Edmund, be reasonable. No one needs to know. And Edmund said, she stopped, gathered herself. Edmund said, I know, Douglas. That's the part you can't fix. She had been holding that since October, and it showed. The relief of saying it in a room where someone was actually listening was visible in her shoulders, which dropped approximately a quarter inch when she finished. Wolfe looked at her with what passes in his emotional register for compassion. You've been carrying that for 6 weeks, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, you were right to bring it here. He rose from his chair, which is the signal that an interview is concluded. Archie will see you out. If you think of anything further, call him, day or night. She nodded. At the door she stopped and turned back. Mr. Wolfe, she said, Edmund was a good man. He deserves better than what happened to him. He does, Wolfe said. That is why we are doing this. I came back from seeing her to the door, and found Wolfe at his desk with a fresh beer, the letter from Edmund Hartwell's envelope, and the expression of a man who has found the first clean thread in a tangled skein, and is beginning to understand how it unravels. "Saul called while you were in the hall," he said. "He'll have a preliminary report tonight." I told Fritz to include him for dinner. I sat down and opened my notebook. "What are we looking at?" I said. "The full picture, as you currently have it." Wolfe touched the letter with one finger. A man who knew he was in danger wrote down the truth and gave it to his most trusted colleague. On the same afternoon, a document bearing what appears to be his signature, uploaded under his partner's credentials, transferred his ownership of a $50 million enterprise for the price of $1. He paused. 3 weeks later, that man died of a heart attack that he had, 6 weeks before his death, asked a colleague whether it was possible to simulate. He was asking because he thought Crane was going to do it to him, I said. Yes. Which means he knew, and he was trying to find a way to prove it or prevent it, and he ran out of time. Yes. Wolfe picked up his beer. The question is not whether Douglas Crane is responsible. I am as confident of that as I am of anything in this room. The question is how it was done and how it can be proven in a manner that satisfies the requirements of law, rather than merely the requirements of reason. The signature, I said. The signature is the key, Wolfe agreed. Not to the murder. That will require reopening the medical examiner's finding, which requires evidence of motive and fraud. But the forgery, it's proven, unravels everything. A forged contract, a corrupted witness, a partner who stood to gain everything. He paused, and somewhere, a green leather journal, which Crane almost certainly destroyed. Almost certainly, Wolfe said, but a man careful enough to plan a murder and forge a legal document may have been careless in the way that careful men often are, in what he didn't consider worth destroying because he didn't know its significance. I thought about that. Tomorrow, I said. Crane comes at 11. Yes. Wolfe finished his beer and set the glass down with the finality of a period at the end of a sentence. I want you to observe him very carefully, Archie. Not what he says, what he does in the first 30 seconds after he enters this office and sees that letter on my desk. You're going to put it where he can see it. I am going to put it where he cannot avoid seeing it. A man who has committed murder for a document will react to the existence of another document in a way that a man who has done nothing will not. He folded his hands over his considerable middle. The reaction itself will tell us a great deal. From the kitchen came the sound and smell of Fritz managing what I was later informed was a duck confit with lentils and a reduction that had taken the better part of the afternoon to achieve. Wolfe's eyes drifted in that direction with the appreciative attention he gives to the things in life that reliably reward it. Dinner at 7, he said. Saul will be here. I suggest you review your notes before then, because tomorrow will require you to be observant in ways that leave no margin for distraction. I said I would. I picked up my notebook and looked at the last line I'd written. I know, Douglas, that's the part you can't fix. Edmund Hartwell had been right about what Douglas Crane intended. He had been wrong about one thing. There was still a part that could be fixed. We were going to fix it. Thursday morning, I was at my desk by 8:30, with fresh coffee, a legal pad, and the particular alertness that comes from knowing the day is going to be interesting. Wolfe's instruction about the letter had been specific. It was to be placed in the center of his desk blotter, face up, in a position that would be visible to anyone entering the office from the hallway. Not prominent enough to suggest it had been placed there deliberately, just present enough that a man who knew what it was would see it before he'd had time to arrange his face. I placed it accordingly and spent 20 minutes considering sightlines from the doorway until I was satisfied with the geometry. Then I sat down and reviewed my notes. Saul Panzer's report from the previous evening had been characteristically thorough. Douglas Crane, he had discovered, had refinanced his personal residence in the 70s in March of this year, a property he'd owned outright, taking out a mortgage of $1.4 million. In June, he had liquidated a brokerage account that had held approximately $800,000 in index funds. In September, 2 weeks before Edmund Hartwell asked Peter Ashby about simulating cardiac arrest, Crane had made 3 wire transfers to a private account in the Cayman Islands, totaling $600,000. Money going out in large quantities is always interesting. The more interesting question is where it's going and why it's going there faster than usual. A man who refinances a paid-off house, liquidates investments, and wires money offshore in the same calendar year is either in serious financial trouble or preparing for something that will make the expenditure worthwhile. The second item in Saul's report was about Gerald Foss. His practice, it turned out, had been in quiet difficulty for the better part of 3 years. 2 large clients lost to a competing firm. A malpractice suit settled confidentially in the spring at a cost Saul estimated at somewhere between $200,000 and $400,000. And then, in October, the same month the contract appeared, Foss had paid off the remaining balance of a business loan of $320,000 in a single payment. I wrote the number down and underlined it twice. A lawyer in financial difficulty, a partner with a secret offshore account, a contract that transferred $50 million worth of equity for $1. The arithmetic, as Wolfe would say, was not subtle. Douglas Crane arrived at 11 on the dot, which told me he was either punctual by nature or had decided that punctuality was strategically useful this morning. He was a tall man, well built in the way of men who have maintained a gym habit into their mid-50s, with silver hair worn short and a face that had the particular handsomeness of someone who has always known they were handsome and factored it into their calculations. He wore a charcoal suit of excellent cut, a white shirt, and a tie the color of old burgundy. He carried an attaché case that he didn't need, and that I suspected he'd brought because it made him feel like a man on business, rather than a man under examination. I watched from my desk. He came through the door, saw Wolfe behind the desk, began to extend his hand for a greeting, and then his eyes dropped to the desk and found the letter. I had been watching for it, and I still nearly missed it. It lasted perhaps a quarter of a second, a contraction of the eyes, a slight cessation of forward movement, a fractional tightening around the jaw. Then it was gone, replaced by the smooth social fluency of a man who has spent decades in rooms full of people whose reactions he wanted to manage. But it had been there, and in that quarter second Douglas Crane had identified what was on Wolfe's desk from across the room, before he could possibly have read a word of it, which meant he knew it existed and he'd been worried about it. He crossed the room, shook Wolfe's hand, took the red leather chair without being invited, which told me he'd decided on the posture of a man at ease. He set the attaché case beside the chair, and gave me a nod that was cordial without being warm. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, "I appreciate you seeing me. I understand Cecilia has engaged your services, which I think is—" He paused with the timing of a man choosing words carefully. "Understandable. She's grieving. She wants answers. I respect that." "Do you?" Wolfe said. It wasn't a question. He poured beer into his glass with the deliberate calm of a man who has nowhere to be and all the time there is to get there. "Tell me about your partnership with Edmund Hartwell." Crane's eyebrows went up fractionally, as if he'd expected something more adversarial and was recalibrating. 23 years, he said. "We built something remarkable together. Edmund's editorial instincts were extraordinary. I've never known anyone with a better eye for a manuscript. My contribution was on the operational side. Finance, distribution, contracts." He paused. "We complemented each other." "And in recent years?" "Every long partnership has its tensions," Crane said. "Edmund and I had different views about the firm's future direction. He wanted to stay boutique. I believed we had an opportunity to scale significantly. There were acquisition conversations with 2 larger publishing groups that Edmund resisted." He said it with the measured fairness of a man presenting both sides of an argument that he has already won. "We disagreed. It's not unusual." The contract of October 14th. Wolfe said. He didn't look at the letter on his desk. He didn't need to. The fact that it was there was doing its own work, and Crane knew it. Crane nodded with what I can only describe as prepared gravity. That was a difficult decision. Edmund came to it reluctantly, but he came to it himself. He'd been thinking about stepping back for some time. The acquisition conversations had made him realize how much he wanted to return to pure editorial work, perhaps as an independent consultant. Transferring his stake was the cleanest way to structure the transition. For $1, Wolfe said. The consideration was symbolic, Crane said. The real value to Edmund was the freedom. We structured it that way at his suggestion. Gerald Foss witnessed the signing. He did. Who else was present? A pause. Barely perceptible, but I had been watching for pauses. It was a private signing, Crane said. Edmund wanted it that way. Just the two of us and Gerald. Where did it take place? At Gerald's office on Park Avenue. I wrote that down. Sylvie Marchand had told me the document was uploaded under Crane's credentials from the firm's office system. Gerald Foss's office was not the firm's office. What time? Wolfe asked. Early afternoon. Around 2:30, I think. The document timestamp said 3:47. You think? Wolfe said. It was several weeks ago, Crane said smoothly. I don't retain every appointment at the minute. Of course not. Wolfe picked up his beer. Mr. Crane, did Edmund Hartwell seem to you, in the weeks before his death, to be a man at peace with the decision he'd made? Crane's expression arranged itself into something between reflection and sorrow. It was well done. He seemed tired, he said. Edmund drove himself very hard. I think the decision to step back was a relief, ultimately, even if the process was difficult. Difficult in what sense? Emotionally difficult. 23 years is a long time. Letting go of something you've built is never simple. Wolfe nodded slowly. He picked up the letter from the center of the blotter, as if examining something he'd been considering, and held it in a way that kept the text facing him without showing it to Crane. Did Edmund Hartwell, at any point in September or October, express to you any concern about his physical safety? The silence that followed was the longest one in the conversation so far. 4 seconds. 5. His physical safety, Crane repeated. His voice hadn't changed. His face hadn't changed. But his right hand, which had been resting on the arm of the red leather chair with the relaxed ease of a man comfortable in his surroundings, moved approximately 2 inches toward the attaché case and stopped. No, of course not. Why would he? I'm asking whether he did, Wolfe said, not why he might. No, Crane said, he did not. Did you, at any point in the same period, have a conversation with Edmund in which you told him to be reasonable and that no one needed to know something? This time the silence was different. It had a texture. The kind of silence that isn't silence at all, but the sound of a man deciding at high speed among several possible responses and calculating the consequences of each. I have many conversations, Crane said finally. I don't recall the specific exchange you're describing. That's not what I asked, Wolfe said pleasantly. I asked whether you had such a conversation. A specific conversation in which you used those words. The failure to recall is itself a form of answer, but it's an imprecise one. Did you or did you not, in roughly September or October of this year, tell Edmund Hartwell to be reasonable and that no one needed to know something? Crane looked at him steadily. I'll give him credit. The look was good, steady, mildly perplexed, with just enough of an edge of indignation to suggest a man being unfairly pressed. Mr. Wolfe, he said, I came here voluntarily to cooperate with your inquiry. I've answered your questions candidly. If you're suggesting something improper occurred in my relationship with Edmund, I'd appreciate you being direct about it. I appreciate directness myself, Wolfe said. Here is some. You refinanced a paid-off property in March for $1.4 million. You liquidated significant investments in June. You transferred $600,000 offshore in September. In October, your attorney who was also Edmund Hartwell's attorney, a detail that is itself remarkable, paid off a substantial business loan in a single payment. Shortly thereafter, a document appeared bearing Edmund Hartwell's signature, transferring his life's work to you, which he never mentioned to his sister, his editorial director, or his personal assistant. 3 weeks after that document appeared, Edmund Hartwell died. He paused and set his beer down. I am being direct. Whatever Crane had prepared for, it wasn't all of that at once. The social fluency didn't break exactly, but it flickered. For just a moment, he was not the man at ease in the red leather chair, but a different man, tighter, colder, behind the eyes. Then the fluency returned. My personal finances, he said carefully, are not relevant to any legitimate inquiry into Edmund's estate. They're relevant to my inquiry, Wolfe said, which is the inquiry that matters at this moment. I think, Crane said, and now there was something new in his voice, a decision being made and enforced in real time, that I should continue this conversation with my attorney present. That is your right, Wolfe said agreeably. I would suggest, however, that you choose an attorney other than Gerald Foss, whose own situation in this matter is becoming complicated. He leaned back in his chair. One final question before you go. When you came into this office this morning, your eyes went immediately to this document on my desk. He held up the letter. Would you like to tell me what you thought it was? Crane looked at the letter. His expression was unreadable in the way that very well-controlled expressions can appear unreadable while actually communicating a great deal. I have no idea what it is, he said. Of course not, Wolfe said. Good morning, Mr. Crane. Crane picked up his attaché case, stood, straightened his jacket, and left the room with the measured pace of a man who is not hurrying because hurrying would mean something. I heard Fritz see him out. The front door closed. He knew what the letter was, I said. He knew of its existence, Wolfe said, which means Edmund told him or threatened him with it, or both. It also means that when Edmund died, Crane expected the letter to die with him, and discovering it here, this morning, in my possession, told him something has gone wrong with his assumptions. He set the letter back on the blotter. He will call Foss within the hour. And Foss comes here tomorrow. Yes, Wolfe's fingers laced together over his middle. There are several threads I want Saul to pull before then. The Park Avenue office of Gerald Foss, the firm's document system, specifically who had administrative access to upload contracts, and the building on Madison Avenue where Hartwell and Crane operated, its security cameras, if any, covering the afternoon of October 14th. The security cameras, I said, are going to require either Foss's cooperation or a warrant. Foss's cooperation, Wolfe said, may be forthcoming under appropriate pressure. A warrant is premature. There is a third option. He looked at me with the particular attention that means the third option involves me doing something he would find tedious but expects I'll manage. The building's property management company, a request for footage from a concerned party in a potential civil matter. You can be very persuasive, Archie, when the situation calls for it. I'm also fairly persuasive when it doesn't, I said. Yes, he said, that is occasionally a problem. He reached for his book. Gerald Foss is Thursday at 11. Before that, I want everything Saul can find about the Park Avenue office and who was in it on October 14th. If Crane's timeline doesn't match the building's records, the mechanism begins to become clear. He opened the book. The conversation was finished. Outside on 35th Street, I was willing to bet that Douglas Crane was in the back of a car with a phone to his ear, and that somewhere on Park Avenue, Gerald Foss's morning was about to become substantially worse. In my experience, the worse their mornings get, the better ours become. Gerald Foss arrived Thursday at 11 with an attorney. Not Crane's attorney, his own, a compact man named Dressel, who wore round glasses and the careful expression of someone who has been briefed on a situation and found it more complicated than advertised. I showed them both into the office with the pleasant formality I use when I want to establish that we have all day, and they don't. Wolfe looked at Dressel with an expression that managed simultaneously to acknowledge his presence and suggest that his presence was entirely optional. "Mr. Foss," he said, "thank you for coming." Gerald Foss was 62, with the complexion of a man who has spent too many years under fluorescent office lighting, and the posture of someone who has been carrying a weight for longer than he'd planned. He had a round face and pale eyes, and the look of a man who had once been somebody's idea of respectable, and was now in the process of discovering what that respect was worth under pressure. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, "my client is here voluntarily and is happy to answer reasonable questions." He glanced at Dressel, who nodded confirmation. "He's already provided a sworn statement regarding the October 14th signing." "I've read the statement," Wolfe said. "It says that Edmund Hartwell signed the contract in Mr. Foss's Park Avenue office at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, in the presence of Mr. Foss and Mr. Crane, and that Mr. Foss witnessed the signature. Is that accurate, Mr. Foss?" "Mr. Crane, when I asked him this morning, said the signing took place in the early afternoon, around 2 or 2:30. The document's timestamp in the firm's system says 3:47, which is correct." Foss looked at Dressel. Dressel gave a small, careful nod. "The document was signed in my office," Foss said. "The timestamp reflects when it was uploaded to the firm's system, which was done later." "By whom?" "I believe Douglas Crane uploaded it when he returned to the office." "From where?" Wolfe asked. "If the signing took place in your office, Mr. Crane would have been coming from Park Avenue to Madison. At what time?" Foss said nothing. "Mr. Foss," Wolfe said, with a gentleness that was precisely as gentle as a blade being drawn slowly, "I want to be very clear about your situation. A man is dead. A document bearing his signature appeared on the same day he wrote a letter stating unequivocally that he had not signed any such document. That letter bears the time 4:47 p.m. If Edmund Hartwell was in your office on Park Avenue at 2:30 signing this contract, how was he in his own office on Madison Avenue at 4:47 writing a letter repudiating it?" The silence that fell was of the kind that precedes a significant change in the arrangement of things. Dressel put his hand on Foss's arm. "Gerald, I need a moment," Foss said. He said it quietly, to no one in particular. He looked at his hands. He looked at the letter on Wolfe's desk, which Wolfe had placed in the same position it had been in that morning, and which Foss, unlike Crane, was not pretending he couldn't identify. "Mr. Foss," Wolfe said, "you are not my primary interest. You are a means to an end. The end is the truth about Edmund Hartwell's death. If you have information that assists in reaching that end, and you provide it voluntarily and fully, that fact will be noted by everyone to whom it is relevant. If you do not, what I have will still be sufficient, and your cooperation will have been unavailable when it might have mattered." He paused. "Those are not threats. They are descriptions of the available paths." Gerald Foss looked up from his hands. His pale eyes had the look of a man who has been in a burning building and has just identified the exit, and is calculating whether he can reach it. "Edmund Hartwell," he said slowly, "was not in my office on October 14th. Dressel closed his eyes briefly, then opened them and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. "Edmund Hartwell," Foss continued, in the voice of a man crossing a bridge that he knows will not support a return journey, "did not sign that contract. I witnessed a signing that did not involve him. I witnessed Douglas Crane sign Edmund Hartwell's name to that document, in my office, on the afternoon of October 14th. I was present. I did not stop it. I have the money to prove I did not stop it, which is the worst thing I have ever done in my professional life, and I am aware of that." He stopped. "I want to talk to my lawyer." "By all means," Wolfe said. He picked up his beer and drank. The room was very quiet. Outside, the November afternoon had turned to early dark the way it does in the city, the sky going from gray to charcoal, without bothering with any intermediate colors. Inside the brownstone on 35th Street, Gerald Foss was talking in low, urgent tones to his attorney. and Nero Wolfe was looking at the middle distance with the expression he gets when the architecture of a case reveals itself to be exactly as he had constructed it in his mind. I looked at my notes. I looked at the letter. I looked at Wolfe. "The forgery is established," I said quietly. "Now we establish the rest." Friday morning, I was out of the brownstone by 8 o'clock, which is early enough in November that Madison Avenue is still doing its preliminary throat clearing. Delivery trucks blocking lanes, coffee carts establishing territorial claims, the first commuters moving with the particular purposeful urgency of people who have somewhere to be and are slightly resentful of it. I had 3 objectives for the day, and a timeline that required all 3 to be accomplished before Vivian Crane arrived at 11. The first objective was the building on Madison. The property management company for the Hartwell and Crane building was a firm called Meridian Property Group, operating out of an office in the low 40s that had the functional cheerlessness of a place where decisions are made about other places. I had called ahead, which meant there was a man named Garrett waiting for me. Mid-30s, cooperative in the manner of someone who has been told by a superior to be cooperative and is following instructions rather than inclination. I explained what I needed: security camera footage from the lobby and elevator banks of the Madison Avenue building, covering the afternoon of October 14th, specifically the period between 2 and 5 p.m. I explained that I was investigating a civil matter related to the estate of a tenant who had died, that the footage might resolve a factual dispute about the movements of individuals in the building that afternoon, and that the alternative to voluntary cooperation was a court order, which would take longer and involve considerably more inconvenience for everyone. Garrett made 2 phone calls. The second one produced authorization. 20 minutes later, I was in a small room with a monitor and a hard drive copy of 4 hours of lobby footage. I watched it twice, taking notes. Edmund Hartwell appeared on the lobby camera at 2:41 p.m., walking toward the elevators with his coat on. He was alone. He pushed the button, waited 11 seconds, got in. The timestamp on the elevator camera showed him at his floor at 2:43. This matched Sylvie Marchand's account precisely. At 4:14 p.m., Edmund Hartwell reappeared at the elevator bank on his floor, rode down, crossed the lobby, and walked out of the building. He moved with the contained deliberateness Sylvie had described, not hurried, not distressed in any obvious way, but with a quality of focused internal attention that reads differently on camera than ordinary purposeful movement. He did not look like a man who had just voluntarily signed away his life's work for $1. He looked like a man who had just survived something and was deciding what to do about it. I also noted the following: Douglas Crane entered the building at 2:58 p.m. and left at 4:03. Gerald Foss entered at 3:12 and left at 3:51. They arrived separately and left separately, with an overlap in the building of 39 minutes. Edmund Hartwell was in the building during the entirety of their visit. He was on his floor, visible on the elevator camera at 4:14 when he finally left, 11 minutes after Crane and 23 minutes after Foss. Not at Gerald Foss's office on Park Avenue, not at a private signing, in his own building, on his own floor, for the entirety of the afternoon. I got a copy of the footage on a thumb drive, and thanked Garrett with the warmth appropriate to someone who has just handed me the structural center of a murder case. The second objective was Park Avenue. Gerald Foss's building had security too, and his cooperation, which Dressel had confirmed by phone late the previous evening, in the careful language of an attorney managing a client who has decided that partial candor is better than full exposure, extended to his building's management. I was in and out in 40 minutes. The Park Avenue lobby camera showed Douglas Crane arriving at 3:05 p.m. and leaving at 3:42. Gerald Foss, who worked in the building, was presumably already there. No one matching Edmund Hartwell's description entered the building at any point on the afternoon of October 14th. Which meant the signing that Gerald Foss had witnessed, the signing he had now admitted to witnessing, while simultaneously admitting it wasn't Edmund Hartwell who signed, had taken place between 3:05 and 3:42 on Park Avenue, while Edmund Hartwell was 11 blocks south on Madison Avenue in his own office for the entire afternoon. The forgery had a time, it had a location, it had two participants, one of whom had already confessed. The structure of the fraud was complete. What remained was the structure of the murder. The third objective was a conversation I hadn't told Wolfe about, because it was the kind of lateral move that he tends to disapprove of in principle while acknowledging in retrospect. I had called Cecilia Hartwell the previous evening and asked her a question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since Chapter 1, which is to say, since the first morning she sat in the red leather chair. The question was about Edmund's apartment. His housekeeper, a woman named Rosa Fuentes, had found him on the morning of November 4th. The apartment had been examined by first responders and briefly by the police before the case was closed as natural causes. No one had gone back. It was clear, been fond of Edmund Hartwell in the uncomplicated way that people sometimes are fond of employers who treat them decently and don't require performance. And his death had hit her as a genuine loss rather than an inconvenience. She let me in and stood by the door while I looked around, which is the right way to handle it. The apartment was what you'd expect of a man who read for a living and thought for pleasure. Books on every horizontal surface, a desk near the window with the comfortable disorder of active use, framed photographs of a life that had accumulated friends and places and moments worth keeping. It was a good apartment. It had the feeling of a place where someone had been genuinely comfortable. I went to the desk first. The top right drawer was unlocked. Empty, apart from a box of paperclips and 2 pens. Rosa confirmed that Edmund had kept a green leather journal in that drawer for as long as she'd known him. It had been there on the evening of November 3rd when she'd last seen Edmund alive. It was not there when she arrived on the morning of November 4th. The apartment had not been broken into. The building had a doorman and a key fob system. The log of entry on the night of November 3rd and the early morning of November 4th showed 2 entries. Edmund Hartwell at 7:48 p.m. and Douglas Crane at 11:17 p.m. I asked Rosa whether Douglas Crane visited often. She said no. She said in 5 years of working there, she could count his visits on one hand. I asked whether she'd mentioned the late-night visit to the police. She said she had, and that the officer had noted it and told her it wasn't unusual for a business partner to visit. I filed that under things the police did not look at carefully enough, and moved on. I went through the apartment methodically, not searching exactly. I had no warrant and no authority, but observing, which is a different activity and produces different information. In the kitchen I found Edmund's medications, a daily vitamin, a blood pressure medication at a low dose, and a bottle of prescription sleep aids, with the pharmacy label showing it had been filled 2 weeks before his death. 11 remained of a 30-day supply. In the bedroom, on the nightstand, a glass of water that Rosa had not removed, and the police had not collected. A habit of order in everything else, books stacked by size, clothes hung by color, that made the water glass notable, only because it was the one thing out of place. I looked at it for a while. Then I took a photograph of it with my phone, thanked Rosa, and left. I was back at the brownstone by 10:40, with 12 minutes to spare before Vivienne Crane was due. Wolfe was in the office when I came in, with his second beer and the Byzantine culinary history, and he listened to my report with the focused stillness of a man receiving information he has been expecting, and is now integrating with what he already knows. When I finished, he set the book down. "The water glass," he said. "It could be nothing," I said. But the apartment was otherwise orderly to a degree that suggested a man with consistent habits. A glass of water on the nightstand that's been there since his death suggests he put it there before he went to bed and didn't drink from it. Or drank from it, and it was refilled, Wolfe said. Rosa says she doesn't refill glasses. She removes them. Wolfe was quiet for a moment. Potassium chloride is water-soluble, he said, odorless and tasteless in solution. It would not require a complex mechanism of delivery. He paused. The glass is not evidence. It is a suggestion. The evidence, if it exists, is in the medical examiner's retained samples, which we cannot access without legal authority. He picked up his beer. What we can do is ensure that the legal authority becomes available very shortly. Foss's confession, I said. Foss's confession establishes fraud and motive, Wolfe agreed. When presented to the appropriate authorities, alongside the footage, the financial records, and Crane's late-night visit to Edmund's apartment on the night of his death, it constitutes a basis for reopening the medical examination. But first, I want to speak with Vivian Crane. You think she knows something? I think, Wolfe said carefully, that she may know something she doesn't know she knows, which is a different problem and requires a different approach. He looked at the door. She arrives in 7 minutes. Bring her in yourself, and stay close. I want your observations. Vivian Crane was not what I had expected, which in my experience is the best possible thing a person can be. I had expected, based on the outline Cecilia had provided, complicated history with Edmund, difficult marriage to Douglas, some variety of the carefully maintained social figure, the woman who has learned to exist in proximity to powerful men by becoming expert at the surfaces of things. Instead, she was a woman of about 50, who dressed without vanity, moved without performance, and had eyes that had clearly seen a great deal, and had decided that pretending otherwise was a waste of everyone's time. She sat in the red leather chair without the self-consciousness that most people bring to it, and looked at Wolfe with the direct attention of someone who has a genuine purpose in being somewhere. "You're smaller than I expected," she said to Wolfe. Then, without pause, "No, you're not. I don't know why I said that. You're exactly as large as you look." Wolfe's expression registered this as mildly interesting. "Mrs. Crane," he said, "you knew Edmund Hartwell." "I knew Edmund very well," she said. 20 years ago, I was briefly in love with him, which Douglas knew and resented, and which Edmund and I decided together to set aside, because the firm mattered more than what we wanted." She said it with the ease of someone discussing a decision made long ago and thoroughly processed. "We remained close, not romantically, closely. He was the most honest person I knew." "When did you last speak with him?" "October 21st, 17 days before he died. He called me from his cell phone, not his office line, which was unusual. He said he wanted me to know that he had documentation of something that Douglas had done, and that he intended to act on it within the next few weeks." She paused. "He said, and I am quoting this exactly because I have repeated it to myself every day since, 'Viv, if Douglas asks whether we've spoken, tell him no. And if anything happens to me, tell Cecilia everything I just told you.'" "Did you tell Cecilia?" I asked. "The morning of the funeral," she said, "which is why she hired you." Wolfe's fingers laced together. "Mrs. Crane, your husband visited Edmund Hartwell's apartment on the night of November 3rd. Did he tell you where he was going?" Something crossed her face. Not surprise. She'd been past surprise for a while. It was more like the expression of someone seeing a piece of a puzzle fit that they'd been holding in isolation. "He told me he was going to the office," she said. "He left at 10:30. He came home at 1 in the morning. I didn't ask." She paused. I had stopped asking Douglas where he went at night some time ago, because the answers were always somewhere between incomplete and false, and I had grown tired of evaluating the gradient. "Were things between you difficult?" I asked. "Things between Douglas and me," she said, "have been difficult since approximately 2019, when I realized that the man I'd married 25 years ago had been steadily replaced by someone I recognized physically, but not in any other meaningful way." She looked at her hands. "Douglas in his 40s was ambitious but warm. Douglas in his 50s is ambitious without the warmth. Something happened to him. I don't know whether it was the firm's success or a quality in him that the success released, but it happened." She looked up. I'll tell you something I've told no one. In September, Douglas came home one evening, and he was charged. That's the only word for it. Like a man who has made a decision and is energized by it. I asked him what had happened, and he said, "Everything is going to be different very soon, Viv." I thought he meant the firm. I thought he'd made a deal. She stopped. Now I wonder what he actually meant. The room was quiet. Wolfe had not moved. I had not moved. The brownstone made its small adjustments around us. "Mrs. Crane," Wolfe said, "I have one more question, and I want you to take whatever time you need before answering. In the past year, have you ever observed your husband in possession of any chemical compound, pharmaceutical, or substance that was not a prescription medication in his name? Anything stored separately, unusually, or with more care than its apparent nature would warrant?" She looked at him for a long time. "Last July," she said finally, "I was looking for aspirin in the bathroom cabinet. On the top shelf, behind Douglas's shaving things, there was a small glass vial without a label. Clear liquid. I asked him what it was, and he said it was a saline solution for contact lenses. Douglas doesn't wear contact lenses." She paused. "He took it out of the cabinet that evening. I didn't see it again." The silence that followed was the loudest one in a week of loud silences. "Did you retain the vial?" Wolfe asked, with the careful gentleness of a man asking a question he already knows the answer to. "No," she said. "I should have. I didn't. I told myself I was being paranoid." She said it without self-reproach, which was more affecting than if she'd said it with it. "I was not being paranoid." "No," Wolfe said quietly. "You were not." He looked at the window. The afternoon outside was the pale, cold light of a New York November that has run out of dramatic gestures and settled into the gray administrative work of getting through to December. "Mrs. Crane," he said, "I want to tell you what is going to happen in the next several days. I am going to gather everyone involved in this matter in this room. I am going to explain what happened to Edmund Hartwell in sufficient detail that the relevant authorities will have no choice but to act. Your husband will be among those present." He paused. "I tell you this not as a warning, but as a courtesy. You should decide before that event whether you intend to be in this city or elsewhere." She looked at him steadily. "I'll be wherever I need to be," she said. "Edmund deserved better. So, for that matter, did I." She stood. "I'd like to help if there's anything I can do." "There may be," Wolfe said. "Archie will call you." I showed her out. When I came back, Wolfe was at his desk with a fresh beer and a legal pad on which he'd written 4 words and underlined them. I leaned over and read them. "The mechanism is complete." Below that, a second line. "Call Saul, Monday, all of them. You're ready." "I have been ready since Thursday morning," Wolfe said, with the mild satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for the evidence to catch up to his conclusions. The question was whether we had enough for the authorities to be compelled to act simultaneously with our confrontation, so that Crane has no window in which to maneuver. He picked up his beer. "We have enough." "The water glass," I said. "We can't prove what was in it." "We don't need to prove the water glass," Wolfe said. "We need to establish the fraud, the motive, the financial transfers, the late-night visit, the unlabeled vial, and the medical examiner's failure to test for potassium specifically. When those elements are presented together, in the presence of a man who has already been identified as a forger by his own co-conspirator, the pressure to reopen the medical examination will be irresistible." He paused. "Potassium chloride leaves traces in the vitreous humor of the eye for longer than in other tissues. If the medical examiner retains samples, which is standard procedure, the test can still be run." I hadn't known that. "You knew that going in," I said. "I suspected it," he said. "I confirmed it with Dr. Vollmer yesterday afternoon while you were out." Theodore Vollmer has been Wolfe's personal physician for 30 years, and his informal medical consultant for nearly as long. I made a note to remember that Wolfe had been 3 steps ahead since Tuesday, which is his natural operating position, and should not have surprised me. "Monday," I said. "All of them." "All of them," Wolfe confirmed. Edmund Hartwell's letter at the center of the desk, where everyone can see it. Fritz to have sufficient refreshments, because it may run long. And Archie. Yes? Inform Inspector Kramer, he said. Not of the details, just that he should be available Monday afternoon and that it concerns the Hartwell matter, which he will shortly discover is not as closed as he currently believes. I picked up my phone. Outside, the city went about its business in the gray November afternoon, entirely unaware that on Monday, in a brownstone on West 35th Street, the account of a dead man's last weeks was going to be read aloud by the one person who had assembled it completely. Edmund Hartwell had written the truth down at 4:47 on an October afternoon. It had taken us 11 days to build the room around it. Saturday in the brownstone is, under ordinary circumstances, the closest thing to a quiet day that the establishment permits itself. Wolfe keeps to his routine. Plant rooms in the morning, lunch, reading in the afternoon, dinner at 7, and I keep to mine, which involves catching up on whatever paperwork the week has generated, doing whatever errands Fritz needs done, and spending a portion of the afternoon doing something that has nothing to do with whoever is currently trying to kill whom. This particular Saturday was not ordinary. I was at my desk by 8 with coffee and the full spread of notes from the week. Every interview, every timestamp, every financial figure Saul had found, every frame of lobby footage I've described in writing, because Wolfe does not watch video, considering it an insufficiently precise medium for factual analysis. I had organized it into a single document of 11 pages, which I placed on his desk before he came down at 11, and which he read, without comment, while his first beer of the morning sat untouched beside him. Wolfe reads the way some people listen to music, completely, with the full engagement of a mind that does not multitask, because it does not need to. He finished all 11 pages in 22 minutes, set the document down, picked up his beer, drank half of it, and looked at the window. I waited. This is the part of working for Nero Wolfe that requires the most discipline. The waiting. He will get there. He always gets there. The instinct to prompt him, to offer a theory, to fill the silence with something, that instinct is the enemy of his process, and after 14 years, I have mostly, though not entirely, conquered it. There are 6 elements, he said finally, still looking at the window. Each is individually significant. Together they constitute a structure that admits only one interpretation. I'm listening, I said, and picked up my pen. First, he said, the motive. Douglas Crane needed money. Not the ordinary financial pressure of a man living beyond his means, but the specific, urgent, deadline-driven need of a man who has made commitments to offshore accounts, to undisclosed parties, to some transaction or obligation that required cash in quantities his legitimate income could not provide. He refinanced, liquidated, and transferred capital in a pattern that suggests a timeline. Something was due. The acquisition of Edmund's stake, obtained for $1 instead of its market value of approximately $20 million, was not merely opportunistic. It was necessary. He drank more beer. I wrote. Second, the mechanism of the fraud. Crane approached Gerald Foss at some point in the late summer. I would estimate August, given Edmund's behavioral change in that month, and made him a proposition that Foss, in his financial difficulty, accepted. Foss would witness a signing that did not occur. He would provide his professional authority to authenticate a document that was fraudulent. In exchange, his loan was paid, $320,000, in October, the same month the contract appeared. The proposition required Foss to do one thing well, and one thing not at all. He had to hold his nerve. He did not have to examine his conscience. He held it for 6 weeks before he sat in your red leather chair, I said. 6 weeks, Wolfe agreed, is longer than I would have given him, based on first impressions, but the money was spent, and the alternative was exposure. Practical considerations are remarkably effective at sustaining moral cowardice. He set his glass down. Third, Edmund's knowledge. He knew from August at the latest that Crane was planning something. He didn't know the precise mechanism. If he had known about the forgery specifically, he would have acted more directly and more immediately. What he knew was the destination, that Douglas intended to take the firm. He was trying to find a way to prevent it that left the firm intact. That hesitation cost him 3 weeks. I thought about Peter Ashby's account, Edmund going quiet, going internal, the man who processed everything out loud, suddenly processing nothing. He was trying to find an exit that didn't blow up what he'd spent 23 years building, I said. Yes, a misplaced loyalty to the institution at the expense of the action that might have saved him. Wolfe's voice carried neither judgment nor sentiment. It was the tone of a man noting a tactical error in a game that is already over. Fourth, the letter. On the afternoon of October 14th, Edmund went for a walk. I believe that walk was not random. I believe he went somewhere specifically, or met someone, or attempted to confront Crane directly. He came back changed. Whatever happened on that walk confirmed something he had only suspected. He went to his desk and wrote the letter, dated and timed it, gave it to Ashby, and went home. "What do you think happened on the walk?" I asked. "I think he met Douglas Crane. I think Crane, or someone acting for Crane, showed him the contract that bore his signature. I think it was presented to Edmund as a fait accompli, a document already executed, already witnessed, already integrated into the firm's records. A threat without explicit words. The message being, this has already happened, and there is nothing you can do about it." He paused. Crane underestimated Edmund's response. He expected capitulation or paralysis. He got documentation. Edmund sat down and wrote the letter, I said. Timed at 4:47, which means whatever happened on that walk happened before 4:47. Between 2:30 and 4:15, Wolfe said, the window of his absence from the building. We don't have him on camera outside, but we have Crane in the Madison Avenue building from 2:58 to 4:03. If Crane left his own building and met Edmund on the street, the building cameras wouldn't capture it. He paused. It's an inference, but it's the inference that best fits the known positions of both men. Could the walk have been a coincidence? Edmund just happened to run into Crane? No, Wolfe said with a flatness that declined to elaborate. Fifth, the murder. He looked at the window again, and the pause this time was longer. Douglas Crane visited Edmund Hartwell's apartment on the night of November 3rd. He told his wife he was going to the office. He arrived at Edmund's building, per the entry log, at 11:17 p.m., and left. The log shows an exit at 11:54 p.m. 37 minutes. Long enough. Edmund's sleep aids, I said. 11 remaining of a 30-day supply, filled 2 weeks before his death. That's 13 pills in 2 weeks, which is one fewer than prescribed, consistent with regular use. A man who takes a sleep aid regularly, Wolfe said, will be deeply asleep by midnight. And a man who is deeply asleep and trusts his visitor will not wake when that visitor enters his bedroom and administers a substance to his water glass. The vial Vivian Crane found in July, which Douglas removed that same evening. A clear, odorless, tasteless liquid. He had been preparing for some time. The vitreous humor, I said, potassium chloride, administered in fatal quantity, would be present in the vitreous fluid of the eye for considerably longer than in blood or urine, Wolfe said. If the medical examiner retained ocular samples, standard in New York County, for any death investigated, however briefly, the test can still be performed. Dr. Vollmer confirmed there is a laboratory that can process such a sample within 48 hours. He picked up his beer. That is the test that will close the case against Crane, in the criminal sense. What we accomplish Monday will close it in every other sense. Sixth, I said. Sixth, Wolfe said. The journal. Douglas Crane went to Edmund's apartment on the night of his death and took the journal. He went to Edmund's office the morning after the funeral and took it from the drawer, if any copy had been left there, or confirmed its absence. The journal is gone. It was, in all probability, the record Edmund had been keeping of everything he knew about Crane's plans, dates, conversations, evidence. Crane needed it to not exist. Can we prove he took it? We can prove he was in the apartment, Wolfe said. We can prove the journal existed, through Sylvie Marchand and Rosa Fuentes. We can prove it was present the evening of November 3rd and absent the morning of November 4th, and that the only visitor between those 2 points was Douglas Crane. He paused. Whether a jury requires more than that to draw the obvious conclusion is a question for the prosecutors. Our task is more limited, to lay the architecture before the relevant parties in sufficient detail that Crane has nowhere to go. He set his glass down and looked at me directly, which is not his habitual orientation. Wolfe tends to address the middle distance when he's working through a problem, and the person across from him when he's arrived at a conclusion. There is one element I have not yet spoken of, he said. The most important one. The element that transforms this from a case of fraud with strong circumstantial evidence of murder into something prosecutable. I looked at my notes. I had 6 elements, and we'd covered 6 elements. You said 6, I said. I miscounted, he said, with the serenity of a man who miscounts things roughly never. The 7th element is the person who knows something that the rest of them don't know she knows. I looked at him. Sylvie Marchand. Sylvie Marchand, he confirmed. She came here Wednesday and told us what she could. But there was a moment when I asked her whether she had ever observed any communication between Edmund and Crane that suggested Crane was aware Edmund knew his plans, when she paused for 4 seconds before answering. And then she told us about the overheard conversation. No one needs to know. I know, Douglas. That's the part you can't fix. A significant thing to have heard, but not the thing she paused about. I went back through my notes. He was right. I had recorded the pause, described it as a woman choosing precision, but I had connected it to the sentence that followed. Wolfe was saying the pause preceded a decision about what to say, and that what she said was not the whole of what she knew. You want me to call her? I said. I want you to visit her, he said. In person, today if possible. I want you to tell her that Gerald Foss has confessed to witnessing a fraudulent signing, that we have footage placing Edmund in his own building throughout the afternoon the signing allegedly occurred, and that we are gathering everyone in this office on Monday. And then, I want you to ask her, in the simplest possible terms, what she has not yet told us. And if she still holds back? She won't, Wolfe said. She is not holding back from reluctance. She is holding back from fear. Fear has a specific cure, which is the credible belief that the thing one fears has already been addressed. When she knows that Crane's position is as exposed as it is, she will tell you. He opened the Byzantine culinary history, which he'd apparently been using as a bookmark for a new volume on the political structure of Renaissance Venice. I recognized the transition. The case had been organized to his satisfaction, and his mind was returning to its default occupation of knowing everything there was to know about everything there was to know. Dinner at 7, he said. Fritz is making sweetbreads. I put on my coat and went to find Sylvie Marchand. She was at home, which was an apartment in the West 80s that had the organized spareness of someone who moves their furniture like chess pieces, everything with a purpose, nothing merely decorative. She let me in with the wariness of someone who has been waiting for a follow-up they weren't sure they wanted, offered me coffee I didn't need, and accepted in the interest of giving her hands something to do, and sat across from me at the kitchen table with the contained anxiety of a person approaching a disclosure they have been rehearsing. I told her what Wolfe had asked me to tell her. Foss's confession, the footage, the financial records, the entry log showing Crane in Edmund's building on the night of November 3rd. She listened without interrupting, holding her own coffee cup with both hands. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment that had a different quality than her earlier silences, less like the suppression of something and more like the release of a decision that had already been made. There's a file, she said. I kept my face where it was. Tell me about the file. Edmund kept a digital file, she said. Password protected, on a personal cloud account, not the firm's system. He told me about it in October, the week after the 14th. He said he'd been documenting everything for 2 months, and that if anything happened to him, I should make sure the file reached Cecilia or his attorney. She paused. Not Gerald Foss. He was specific about that. He said, "Not Foss, Sylvie. Find someone else." I looked at her steadily. He knew about Foss. He must have. He didn't say so explicitly, but he was specific enough about excluding him that it was clear. She set her coffee down. After Edmund died and the case was closed, I was frightened. I didn't know whether Douglas knew about the file. I didn't know whether Edmund had told anyone else. I sat on it because acting on it felt like putting myself in the same position Edmund was in. "What made you tell Cecilia about the contract?" I asked. "Because the contract was something I could prove I knew about legitimately," she said. "I found it in the system. I have every right to access the system." "But the file," she stopped. "The file felt different, like something Douglas might come after me for." I understood that. I also understood that she'd been carrying it for 6 weeks, and that the weight of it was visible in the way she held herself. "Does the file still exist?" I asked. "I believe so," she said. "I haven't accessed it. I have the account information Edmund gave me, written on a card in his handwriting. I've been keeping it in my apartment, in a book." She looked at me. "Is it safe to use it now?" "With Foss's confession and the physical evidence we have," I said, "Crane's ability to act against anyone is diminishing by the hour. And Monday, it goes to 0. I paused. "What's the account?" She got up and went to the bookcase. From between the pages of a novel, I noted the title automatically, a habit from years of professional observation, The Count of Monte Cristo, which under the circumstances was either coincidental or the most appropriate thing I'd seen all week. She produced a small index card in a handwriting I recognized from the letter on Wolfe's desk. The card had a username, a password, and a single line below it. "Everything Douglas did, in order, with dates. VH. Edmund Hartwell. Documented in chronological order, with dates, everything he knew about what Douglas Crane had been planning." "We'll need to access this before Monday," I said. "Mr. Wolfe will want to review whatever is in it." She nodded. "I'll send you the login information tonight." She looked at me with the directness she'd shown from the beginning, the quality of a person who observes accurately and speaks precisely. "Mr. Goodwin, is Edmund's death going to be properly investigated?" "Yes," I said. "You're certain?" "Mr. Wolfe," I said, "is certain, which in practical terms is the same thing." She nodded once, with the decisive finality of someone closing a chapter they've been unable to close for 6 weeks. I finished the coffee, thanked her, and left. Back at the brownstone by 4 in the afternoon, I found Wolfe in the kitchen, with Fritz, in the middle of a detailed discussion about the proper temperature for the preparation of sweetbreads, which I declined to interrupt because it was clearly going well for both of them, and because I knew where to find him at 7. I went to the office, sat at my desk, and opened my laptop. The cloud account credentials arrived from Sylvie Marchand at 4:47, the same time Edmund Hartwell had written his letter, which I noted as a coincidence, and then decided was not the kind of coincidence worth analyzing, and instead logged in. Edmund Hartwell's file was 63 pages. He had started it on August 9th and written the last entry on November 1st, 2 days before he died. It was written with the precision of a man who understood that he might be building a legal case and wanted it to hold up. Dates, times, locations, direct quotations where he had them, clear labeling of what he'd witnessed personally versus what he'd inferred. I read it twice. The second time I took notes. By 6:30 I had everything I needed, and 3 things I hadn't expected. The first was that Edmund had known about Foss's financial difficulties since September. He'd learned it from a mutual acquaintance in the legal community who'd mentioned it without knowing its relevance. He'd understood immediately what it meant. that Foss was vulnerable, and that Crane would know that. The second was that the offshore account Saul had traced belonged to an entity called Meridian Atlantic Holdings, a name that took me approximately 4 seconds to connect to the property management company whose lobby footage I'd collected on Friday morning. The company that had authorized Garrett to let me see the footage was, it turned out, a shell entity that shared a name with the company handling Crane's offshore transfers. Whether this was meaningful or an extraordinary coincidence, I couldn't yet determine, and I set it aside for Wolfe. The third was an entry dated October 14th at 9:17 p.m., written after Edmund had returned home, and after he'd written the letter and given it to Ashby. It said, "DC showed me the contract at 3:30 on the street outside Foss's building on Park Avenue. He had a copy. He said it was done, and that I should be reasonable about the transition. I told him I knew, and that was the part he couldn't fix. He said, 'Edmund, don't make this harder than it has to be.' I came back to the office and wrote the letter for Pete. Tonight I am writing this. If Douglas does what I think he will do, it will be because he has run out of patience, and has more to lose from my fighting it than from ending it. I have written everything I know in this file. I have given the letter to Pete. I am going to call Viv tomorrow and tell her where to find what I found. I do not know if this will be enough. I am going to find out. He hadn't found out. He'd been killed 2 weeks before he could." I sat at my desk in the November quiet of the brownstone on West 35th Street and read that entry 3 more times. Then I closed the laptop and went to the kitchen door and told Wolfe dinner could wait 15 minutes because I had something he needed to see. He came to the office. He read the file, not all of it. I showed him the relevant entries and the summary I'd constructed, and he read with the focused absorption he brings to texts that matter. When he finished, he sat back and was quiet for 60 seconds. "Meridian Atlantic Holdings," he said. "I noticed that too," I said. "It may be coincidental," he said. "It may be," I said. "It is not coincidental," he said. "It means that the property management company, or someone controlling it, is connected to Crane's financial operation. Which means the authorization to show you the lobby footage was either a mistake or a test." He paused. "Call Saul tonight. I want to know who owns Meridian Property Group." "If it's Crane," I said, "then showing me the footage was a mistake." "An expensive one," Wolfe said. He rose from the chair with the deliberate unhurriedness of a man who has just added the final room to a building he's been constructing in his head for 10 days. "Come. Fritz's sweetbreads will not improve with waiting, and Monday will require us to be fully resourced." I followed him to the dining room, where Fritz had set the table with the quiet ceremony he brings to every meal in that brownstone, as though each dinner is a small argument for the proposition that civilization is worth maintaining. Wolfe sat, unfolded his napkin, and looked at the first course with the appreciation of a man whose relationship with good food is one of the few uncomplicated pleasures he permits himself. "Monday," I said. "What do you need from me between now and then?" "Saul's report on Meridian Property Group," he said. "Confirmation from Dr. Vollmer that he can have a representative present to facilitate the request for retained samples immediately following our meeting. A call to Inspector Kramer, not later than Sunday evening, informing him that Monday afternoon will require his presence, and that of whatever colleagues he considers appropriate." He picked up his fork. "And I want the room arranged so that Douglas Crane sits directly across from me, with the letter visible from his position and the door behind him. You want him to feel that there's no exit." "I want him to know there isn't one," Wolfe said. "There's a difference." He began to eat. Across the table, a copy of Edmund Hartwell's 63-page file sat on the sideboard where I'd left it, next to the letter dated October 14th at 4:47 p.m., and the thumb drive containing lobby footage of a man who had known he was running out of time and had spent every remaining day building the case that would outlast him. He had done enough. We were going to make sure it counted. Sunday passed the way Sundays do in the brownstone when a case is 24 hours from resolution. with the surface calm of an ordinary day, and the underlying tension of a room in which something is being held very carefully in place. Wolfe spent the morning with his orchids, the afternoon with Renaissance Venice, and the evening with Fritz's roast chicken and a bottle of Montrachet that deserved better company than a Sunday night vigil, though it didn't complain. I spent it working. Saul called at 2 in the afternoon with the Meridian Property Group report. It took him 30 seconds to deliver the essential fact. Meridian Property Group was owned, through 2 layers of holding companies, incorporated in Delaware, by a private equity entity whose managing partner was a man named Charles Reddick, who was, per 3 different financial databases Saul had accessed, with the cheerful illegality he brings to such things, the same Charles Reddick who appeared as a signatory on the Cayman Islands account to which Douglas Crane had transferred $600,000 in September. Which meant that the property management company that managed the Hartwell and Crane building was controlled by a financial associate of Douglas Crane. Which meant that when I had called Meridian Property Group Friday morning and asked for lobby footage, my request had gone up a chain that terminated, eventually, with a man who had a direct financial relationship with the primary suspect in my investigation. And they had given me the footage anyway. I told Wolfe at 3. He listened from behind his book, set the book down, and was quiet for 45 seconds. "They gave you the footage," he said. "Without hesitation," I said. Garrett made 2 phone calls and then sat me down in front of a monitor. "Why?" Wolfe said, not as a question. "Either they didn't know what was on it," I said, "or they knew and calculated that withholding it would look worse than releasing it. Or, Wolfe said, they released it because they believed the footage supported their version of events, and they had not accounted for the fact that Gerald Foss would confess, or that Edmund Hartwell had maintained a 63-page digital record." He paused. "Crane is not unintelligent. He is a man who planned carefully in the areas he understood, and failed to account for the areas he didn't. He understood financial mechanics, legal instruments, and the management of physical evidence. He did not understand that the people who knew Edmund Hartwell would be both more observant and more persistent than he anticipated." "He didn't count on Cecilia," I said. "He didn't count on any of them," Wolfe said. "Sylvie Marchand, Peter Ashby, Vivian, each of them held something. None of them let go." He picked up his book. "Call Kramer." Inspector Kramer took the call at 4:30 with the resigned skepticism he always brings to conversations that begin with my voice. Kramer is a large, solid man who has been a police inspector long enough to have developed a complex relationship with Wolfe. He resents the implication that his department requires assistance, acknowledges in practice that it occasionally does, and manages the contradiction by being permanently, professionally irritable about it. I told him, Monday afternoon, 3 o'clock, West 35th Street. I told him it concerned the death of Edmund Hartwell. I told him there would be a confession already on record, physical evidence in the form of documentary and financial records, security footage, and testimony from multiple witnesses, and that there would also be a request for the medical examiner's office to conduct specific additional testing on retained samples. There was a silence of approximately 5 seconds. "Hartwell," Kramer said, "that's a closed case." "It will be a different kind of closed by Monday evening," I said. Another silence. "Wolfe going to be there?" "He's not planning to be elsewhere," I said. 3 o'clock, Kramer said, and hung up. Which from Kramer constitutes enthusiastic cooperation. I called Dr. Vollmer, who confirmed he would have a colleague from the Forensic Pathology Department available by phone Monday afternoon, and that the request for retained sample testing could be initiated within an hour of formal notification to the medical examiner's office. I called Cecilia Hartwell, who said she would be there, and said it with the contained steadiness of a woman who has been steady for 11 days, and intends to remain so through the finish. I called Peter Ashby, Sylvie Marchand, and Vivienne Crane, and confirmed their times. I sent a formal written notice to Gerald Foss's attorney, which Dressel acknowledged within the hour, with a confirmation and a request that his client's cooperation be noted for the record. That left Douglas Crane. I called him at 5:30. His assistant said he was unavailable. I said to tell him that Nero Wolfe was convening a meeting at 3 o'clock Monday afternoon concerning the estate of Edmund Hartwell, and that his presence was requested. I said if he didn't come voluntarily, Inspector Kramer of the NYPD would be happy to facilitate his attendance by other means. Crane called back in 11 minutes. "I'll be there," he said. His voice was as smooth as it had been Thursday morning, perhaps a fraction more controlled, the way a smooth surface becomes more noticeably smooth when something is pressing against it from the other side. "I want it noted that I'm attending voluntarily." "Noted," I said warmly. "Don't be late." Monday morning, the brownstone on West 35th Street. I was up at 7. By 9 I had the office arranged to Wolfe's specifications. The red leather chair, positioned to face the desk directly. 4 additional chairs arranged in a shallow arc to its left and right. Douglas Crane's chair specifically placed so that the desk was in front of him, the door was behind him, and Edmund Hartwell's letter was on the blotter at the precise angle that made it legible from that position. Fritz had set up a credenza with coffee, tea, and the kind of substantial refreshments that say, "We may be here a while, and we intend to be comfortable about it." At 10, I printed 3 copies of Edmund's 63-page file, and placed them in manila folders, one for Wolfe, one for Kramer, one for the record. At 10:30 Saul Panzer arrived, drank a cup of Fritz's coffee, and positioned himself in the hall with the unobtrusive effectiveness he brings to everything. Visible enough to suggest there were more people involved than just Wolfe and me. Present enough to discourage anyone who might be weighing their exit options. At 11, Wolfe came down from the plant rooms, settled into his chair, looked at the arrangement of the room, and said nothing, which meant it was correct. We waited. They came in stages which I had planned deliberately. I wanted them in the room before Crane arrived, seated and settled, so that when he walked in, he would find himself entering a space already occupied by people who knew what he had done. Cecilia Hartwell arrived at 2:30, composed and dark-eyed, and wearing the same charcoal coat she'd had on 11 days ago when she first walked into this room. She took a chair to the left of the ark, and folded her hands in her lap, and looked at Wolfe with the expression of someone who has spent 11 days trusting a process she couldn't fully see, and is now about to see it. Peter Ashby came at 2:35, took the chair beside Cecilia, and nodded at me with the contained energy of a man who has been angry for 6 weeks, and has disciplined the anger into something useful. Sylvie Marchand came at 2:40, sat in the next chair, and placed her bag on her lap and her hands on her bag, and looked at the letter on Wolfe's desk with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Grief and relief, in some proportion, I won't pretend to calculate. Vivian Crane arrived at 2:45. She took the chair at the far right of the ark, crossed her legs, and looked at the door with the expression of a woman waiting for something she has been waiting for long enough that the waiting has become a form of patience she doesn't plan to abandon now. Gerald Foss and his attorney Dressel came at 2:55. Foss looked like a man who has made a decision he knows was right, and is still paying the full price for having taken so long to make it. He took the remaining chair in the ark. Dressel stood against the wall. Inspector Kramer arrived at 2:58, with a detective named Pearlie Stebbins, who has the build and expression of a man who once considered a career as a structural support beam, and retains the professional qualities of that aspiration. Kramer looked at the room, looked at Wolfe, looked at me, and took up a position to the right of the door, with his arms folded, and his expression set at the low-level skeptical attention he maintains until something gives him reason to adjust it. At 3:02, the doorbell rang. Fritz answered it. Footsteps in the hall. Douglas Crane came through the door. He was dressed as well as he'd been Thursday. Different suit, same quality, same charcoal and white precision that says, I have arrived at the hour of my own choosing, and on my own terms. He walked into the room, saw the arrangement of people, and processed it in approximately 2 seconds with the rapid social calculation of a man who has spent decades reading rooms professionally. He saw Foss. Something moved behind his eyes. Not panic, not yet, but the rapid adjustment of a man revising a set of assumptions he'd believed were solid. He saw Kramer. The revision continued. He took his chair, the one facing Wolfe, with the letter visible on the blotter, and sat down with the deliberate composure of someone who has decided that composure is the last instrument available to him, and intends to use it until told otherwise. "Mr. Wolfe," he said. "Quite a gathering." "Sit down, Mr. Crane," Wolfe said, with the mildness of a man pointing out that his guest is already seated. "We will begin." "I am going to describe," Wolfe said, "a sequence of events beginning in August of this year and ending on November 4th. I will be specific about dates, locations, and amounts. When I am finished, Inspector Kramer will have sufficient basis to act. If anyone in this room wishes to correct or supplement my account as I proceed, they may do so. I recommend accuracy." He looked at no one in particular, which is how he begins things, and then settled his gaze on Douglas Crane in the way that a lens settles sunlight. In August, Douglas Crane approached Gerald Foss with a proposition. Mr. Foss's practice was in financial difficulty. Mr. Crane was aware of this, as he was aware of most things that could be converted into leverage. The proposition was this: Mr. Foss would authenticate a document bearing Edmund Hartwell's signature. A document Hartwell had not signed and would not sign, in exchange for the settlement of Mr. Foss's outstanding business obligations. He paused. Mr. Foss accepted. The payment of $320,000 in October confirms this, and Mr. Foss has confirmed it himself. He looked briefly at Foss, who looked at his hands. "I note that Mr. Foss's confirmation was offered voluntarily, under no legal compulsion, and that this fact will be relevant to whatever arrangements follow today's events." Crane said nothing. He was looking at Wolfe with the attention of a man watching a controlled demolition, and calculating at which point the structure he's in begins to fall. In September, Edmund Hartwell, who had become aware in August that Crane was planning to dispossess him of his ownership stake by some mechanism he could not yet identify, began maintaining a digital record of everything he knew and observed. He entrusted the access credentials for this record to his personal assistant, Sylvie Marchand, in October, with instructions to ensure it reached his family if anything happened to him. Wolfe paused. That file consists of 63 pages and covers the period from August 9th to November 1st. Inspector Kramer has a copy. Kramer, against the wall, patted the folder under his arm without expression. On October 14th, Wolfe continued, a contract was executed in Gerald Foss's Park Avenue office by Douglas Crane, who signed Edmund Hartwell's name to a document transferring Hartwell's 40% stake in Hartwell and Crane Publishing to Crane himself for $1. Gerald Foss witnessed this. Edmund Hartwell was not present. Security footage from the Park Avenue building confirms that Edmund Hartwell did not enter the building at any point on October 14th. Security footage from the Hartwell and Crane building on Madison Avenue confirms that Edmund Hartwell was in his own office throughout the afternoon, including the period during which the Park Avenue signing allegedly occurred. He looked around the room. At 3:30 p.m. on October 14th, Edmund Hartwell was shown a copy of this fraudulent contract by Douglas Crane on the street outside Foss's building. Crane had been waiting for him, or intercepted him, or arranged to meet him. The precise mechanism is less important than the fact, which is established in Edmund's own words in his digital file. He picked up the letter from the blotter. Edmund returned to his office and wrote this letter, which he gave to Peter Ashby with instructions to open it if anything happened to him. He dated it October 14th and timed it 4:47 p.m. It unequivocally repudiates any document purporting to reflect a voluntary transfer of his ownership interest. He set the letter down. Edmund Hartwell spent the following 3 weeks attempting to determine a course of action. He called Vivian Crane on October 21st and told her he had documentation of what Douglas had done. He continued his file. He was, in his own words, trying to find a way out that did not destroy what he and Crane had built. He did not find it in time. Wolfe picked up his beer, drank once, and set it down. On the evening of November 3rd, Douglas Crane left his residence at 10:30 p.m., telling his wife he was going to the office. He went instead to Edmund Hartwell's apartment building on the Upper West Side. The building's entry log records his arrival at 11:17 p.m. and his departure at 11:54 p.m. Edmund Hartwell took prescription sleep medication regularly. At 11:17, he would have been asleep. Wolfe paused. In July, Vivian Crane discovered in her bathroom cabinet a small, unlabeled glass vial containing a clear liquid. She asked her husband about it. He told her it was saline solution. He does not wear contact lenses. He removed the vial that same evening. The room was very quiet. Wolfe's voice was the only sound, and it had the quality of something inevitable. Potassium chloride, administered in solution to a sleeping man's water glass, would cause cardiac arrest within the hour. It is odorless, tasteless, and water-soluble. In post-mortem analysis, it is effectively undetectable in blood and urine because potassium levels rise naturally after death. It is, however, detectable in the vitreous humor of the eye for a significantly longer period. Edmund Hartwell's death was investigated as a suspected natural death. The medical examiner found elevated potassium, noted it as consistent with natural post-mortem processes, and closed the case. Specific testing for ante-mortem potassium elevation was not conducted. He looked at Kramer. It can still be conducted if retained samples exist, which they do. Kramer unfolded his arms. Stebbins shifted his weight. Wolfe looked at Douglas Crane. "Mr. Crane," he said, "you went to Edmund Hartwell's apartment on the night of November 3rd and poisoned him. You removed his personal journal, which documented your fraud, either that night or on the following morning when you accessed his office before other staff arrived. You did this because Edmund had told you, on the afternoon of October 14th, that he knew, and that was the part you couldn't fix." He paused. "He was wrong about that. You fixed it the only way available to you. You killed him." The room held its breath. Douglas Crane looked at Wolfe for a long moment. Then he looked at Foss. Then at Vivienne, who met his eyes with the expression of a woman looking at something she has known for a long time and has no more reason to pretend she doesn't. When he looked back at Wolfe, something had shifted in him. Not collapsed. Crane was not the collapsing type. But the composure had changed its nature. It was no longer the composure of a man in control of his circumstances. It was the composure of a man who has run the calculations and found them final. "That is a very complete account," Crane said. "Yes," Wolfe said. "I'd like to speak with my attorney," Crane said. "You'll have ample opportunity," Wolfe said. "Inspector Kramer will facilitate that." Kramer was already moving. Stebbins was beside Crane before the sentence was finished, which is the kind of professional coordination that Stebbins is actually very good at, whatever one might think of his conversation. He straightened his jacket with the automatic precision of muscle memory. He looked once more at Vivienne, who looked back at him with nothing that could be identified as the opposite of love, but was the complete absence of it. He looked at Foss, who did not look up. He did not look at Cecilia Hartwell, which told me more about him than anything he'd said in 2 interviews. Stebbins walked him out. The sound of the front door closing had a finality to it that Fritz's old brownstone walls absorbed without comment. What was left in the room was not exactly silence. It was something more specific. the particular quiet of people who have been holding something for a long time and have just set it down. Cecilia Hartwell's composure broke, very briefly, in the way that genuine composure sometimes does, when the thing it's been holding against finally gives way. She pressed her fingers to her mouth, recovered in approximately 4 seconds, and looked at Wolfe with eyes that said everything she didn't need to put into words. Wolfe looked back at her, with the expression of a man who finds excessive sentiment uncomfortable, but recognizes the genuine article when it's in front of him. "He kept the record," Wolfe said quietly. Everything that followed was a matter of finding it. She nodded once. That was all. Kramer came back in 20 minutes later, after Crane had been processed in the hallway, with the efficiency that Stebbins and a backup unit from the precinct had provided. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, and the expression of a man who has been right to be skeptical of Nero Wolfe for 30 years, and continues to be right in ways that produce outcomes he can't entirely argue with. "The ME's office," he said. "I'll have it initiated tonight." "Thank you," Wolfe said. Kramer's mouth did something that wasn't quite an acknowledgement, and wasn't quite a complaint. "The Foss situation," he said. "Mr. Foss has been cooperative and forthcoming. I imagine the district attorney will take note of that." Kramer looked at Foss, who was still sitting in his chair with Dressel beside him, and the look of a man working out what comes next, one careful step at a time. "We'll need a full statement," he said. "He'll give one," Dressel said from the wall. It was the third thing he'd said all afternoon. Kramer nodded. He looked at me. "You could have called me earlier in this process." "We called you when we had something to hand you," I said pleasantly. "You're welcome." He put his hat on and left. The backup unit had been and gone. The brownstone was quiet again, with the remaining people in it. Cecilia, Ashby, Sylvie, Vivienne, Foss, and Dressel, beginning the quiet process of departure. Fritz appearing at the doorway to collect coffee cups, with the unobtrusive efficiency of a man who has witnessed the resolution of several dozen cases in this room, and treats each one with the same professional composure. Peter Ashby stopped beside my desk on his way out, and extended his hand. "Edmund would have liked this," he said. "He would have found Wolfe extremely irritating," I said. "In the way that people find things irritating that are better than them at the thing they value most." Ashby almost smiled. "Yes," he said, "exactly like that." Sylvie Marchant paused at the door and looked back at the room, at the desk, at the letter, at the general arrangement of a place where the thing she'd been carrying for 6 weeks had finally been put down properly. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Vivienne Crane left last, after a brief exchange with Wolfe that I didn't hear because I was seeing Foss and Dressel out. When I came back she was gone, and Wolfe was at his desk with a fresh beer and the particular settled quality of a man who has done what he set out to do, and is now in the process of returning to his preferred state of informed inactivity. I sat down at my desk. "The Meridian connection," I said. "Reddick." "A matter for the Financial Crimes Division," Wolfe said. "We have provided Inspector Kramer with the documentation. Whatever Crane and Reddick were doing with that money is a separate investigation, and a larger one. It is not our problem. Unless Cecilia wants it to be." "If Cecilia wants it pursued, she can retain us again," Wolfe said. "At present, our engagement is fulfilled." He picked up the Renaissance Venice book. I looked at my notes, at the 11 days of interviews and timestamps and financial records and lobby footage that had assembled themselves into a complete account of what Douglas Crane had done to a man he'd built something with for 23 years. "One thing," I said. Wolfe looked up. Edmund wrote in his file that he was trying to find a way out that didn't destroy what they'd built. He spent 3 weeks trying to save the firm. I paused. "What happens to Hartwell and Crane now?" Wolfe considered this. "The fraudulent contract will be voided. Edmund's estate will recover his 40% stake. Cecilia, as the administrator of the estate, will determine what to do with it. Peter Ashby has been running the editorial operation for 23 years. He is the obvious choice to continue it. Edmund would have thought so too, I said. Yes, Wolfe said, he would have. He returned to his book. Outside, the November afternoon was doing what late November afternoons do in New York, going dark earlier than seems reasonable. The streetlights on 35th Street coming on in the particular amber that turns the city briefly into something warmer than it intends to be. Inside, Fritz was in the kitchen, beginning whatever dinner was going to be, and the brownstone was settling around us with the comfortable predictability of a place that knows what it is and is satisfied with it. Tomorrow, the medical examiner's office would test the retained samples and find what Wolfe was certain they would find. The day after that, the district attorney's office would begin the process that would end Douglas Crane's careful, planned, ultimately insufficient effort to take what wasn't his. Gerald Foss would face consequences that were serious and appropriate, and somewhat mitigated by the fact that he had, when the room was arranged correctly and the pressure was sufficient, done the right thing. The firm on Madison Avenue would continue. The books would continue to be found and published and sent out into the world, which is the thing Edmund Hartwell had spent his professional life believing was worth doing. And somewhere in a cloud account that would shortly be entered into evidence, 63 pages of careful, precise, dated documentation would finish the work that its author had not lived to see completed. I do not know if this will be enough, he had written. I am going to find out. Now he knew. Tuesday arrived with the quiet authority of a day that knows it is the last in a sequence, and behaves accordingly. Clear sky over Manhattan for the first time in a week. The November light, thin and precise, the kind of morning that makes the city look like it has been recently edited for accuracy. I was at my desk by 8:30 with coffee and the comfortable absence of urgency that follows the resolution of a case that has required 10 days of sustained urgency. The urgency wasn't entirely gone. It had simply changed its address. At 9:15, Inspector Kramer called to inform me that the medical examiner's office had located the retained ocular samples from Edmund Hartwell's post-mortem, and that specific testing for potassium chloride concentration had been initiated the previous evening. Results within 36 hours. His voice had the quality it gets when professional obligation and personal satisfaction are operating simultaneously, and he hasn't decided how to distribute credit for the latter. At 9:45, Dressel called to confirm that Gerald Foss had provided a full written statement to the district attorney's office, and that the statement had been accepted as cooperative testimony in what was now an active investigation. He said it with the careful neutrality of an attorney who has navigated his client through a very narrow passage, and is not yet certain how wide the passage on the other side is going to be. I told him Wolfe would note the cooperation if asked, which is all I could honestly say. At 10, Cecilia Hartwell called. She had spoken with the estate's new attorney, not Foss, someone Ashby had recommended, and the fraudulent contract had been formally challenged with the documentation we had provided. The process of voiding it would take several weeks, but the attorney had described the outcome as not in serious doubt. She said it the way people say things that are both legally cautious and personally certain. Then she said, "Mr. Goodwin, I want to ask you something." "Go ahead," I said. "When my brother wrote that letter, the one he gave to Peter, he already knew the contract existed. He already knew what Douglas had done. Why didn't he go to the police that same day?" It was the question I had been sitting with for several days, and I had an answer that I believed was true. "Because the contract bore what appeared to be his signature," I said. 3 lawyers later confirmed it looked like his signature. 2 witnesses were prepared to say they'd seen him sign it. If he'd gone to the police on October 14th with a piece of paper saying he didn't sign it, against a witness contract and 2 human beings ready to swear otherwise, the police would have told him it was a civil matter and suggested he get an attorney, which he already had, and who had just switched sides. A pause. He had no one to go to who could prove it fast enough. He was building the proof, I said. He'd been building it since August. He needed more time than Douglas gave him. Another pause, longer. Mr. Wolfe built it in 10 days, she said. Mr. Wolfe, I said, had something your brother didn't. He had your brother's 63 pages, Peter Ashby's letter, Sylvie Marchand's records, Vivian's testimony, and the considerable advantage of nobody having tried to kill him yet. I paused. Your brother did everything right, Miss Hartwell. He documented, he protected the record, he warned the people who needed warning. He bought us everything we needed. He just didn't get to see it used. She was quiet for a moment that had the quality of something being set down carefully. Thank you, she said, for all of it. After she hung up, I sat at my desk for a moment, with the phone still in my hand, looking at the opposite wall, where Wolfe keeps a painting of a waterfall that he has never explained and I have never asked about, and thought about Edmund Hartwell sitting at his desk on the afternoon of October 14th, writing the truth in his own unmistakable hand, because it was the only instrument he had left, and he intended to use it. Then I put the phone down and went to see if Wolfe wanted anything before his 11 o'clock ascent to the plant rooms. He was in the office, with his morning mail and his first coffee. Wolfe takes coffee only in the morning, before beer becomes appropriate, and only Fritz's, which means he is effectively the only person alive who has solved the coffee problem completely. He looked up when I came in, with the expression of a man who has read all the relevant reports, and is now processing them in the unhurried way of someone under no external deadline. Kramer called, I said, and gave him the summary. He nodded once. The result will confirm what we know, he said. It was the flat observation of a man who has constructed an argument from sufficient evidence and sees no reason to pretend uncertainty he doesn't feel. Probably worth waiting for it officially before we declare victory, I said. I declared nothing, Wolfe said. I described what happened. The laboratory will provide confirmation. The distinction between description and declaration is not trivial. My mistake, I said. In the meantime, I have a question I've been holding on to. He looked at me over his coffee. This is his invitation. The title, I said. The Forgotten Signature. The case is about a forged signature, not a forgotten one. Edmund's signature was very precisely remembered, copied, reproduced, fraudulently deployed. It was the opposite of forgotten. He laced his fingers over his middle and looked at the ceiling with the meditative attention he brings to questions that interest him, which not all questions do. The forged signature, he said, is the instrument of the crime. It is the mechanism, but it is not the forgotten thing. He paused. What was forgotten? Deliberately, calculatedly, with full knowledge of what was being erased, was the signature Edmund Hartwell did not write. The signature that was never asked for, because it would never have been given. The signature that represents 40% of a firm, built over 23 years, and a professional relationship of equivalent duration, and the judgment of a man whose editorial instincts were, by universal acknowledgment, extraordinary. He looked at the window. Douglas Crane did not forge Edmund Hartwell's signature. He forgot it. He decided that it didn't matter, that it was a formality that could be manufactured, an obstacle that could be circumvented, a thing of no essential significance, because the man attached to it could be removed. He picked up his coffee. That is the error of a man who has spent too long thinking about value in purely financial terms. Edmund Hartwell's signature on a document mattered because of what it represented, the consent and judgment of a particular human being with particular qualities. You cannot manufacture that consent. You can only pretend to, and the pretense eventually fails. In trying to acquire what Edmund had built, Crane demonstrated precisely why he could never have built it himself. I thought about that for a moment. Edmund knew that, I said. That's why he wasn't afraid of the contract as a legal instrument. He was afraid of what Crane would do when he realized the contract wasn't going to be enough. Yes, Wolfe said. He was right to be afraid, and he was right about everything else. He simply ran out of time. He stood, which meant the plant rooms were calling. At the doorway he paused, which he rarely does. Archie, he said. Yes, The 63 pages, he said. Edmund Hartwell was not a detective. He was an editor. He organized evidence with the same care he would have brought to a manuscript, clearly, chronologically, with attention to what mattered, and the discipline to exclude what didn't. He paused. It was the finest piece of investigative documentation I have encountered in some years. Note that somewhere. He went upstairs. I noted it. The 36 hours turned into 22. Kramer called at 7:15 Tuesday evening, which is during dinner at the Brownstone, and therefore a transgression. But I took it in the hall, because Kramer calling during dinner means something has happened that is worth the transgression. Potassium chloride, he said. Concentration in the vitreous samples is approximately 4 times what would be expected from natural post-mortem elevation. The ME is reopening the case as a homicide. A pause. Wolfe was right. He usually is, I said. He'll be pleased you called. He's going to be insufferable about this, Kramer said. Inspector, I said, he's insufferable regardless. This at least gives him something to be insufferable about. Kramer made a sound that in a more generous man might have been a laugh, and hung up. I went back to the dining room. Wolfe looked at me across a plate of Fritz's osso buco that had been working on the stove since 2 in the afternoon, and was, if the smell was any indication, one of the finest arguments for civilization I had encountered this week, or possibly this year. Kramer, I said, the samples confirmed it. Potassium chloride at 4 times normal concentration. The ME is reopening as homicide. Wolfe said nothing for a moment. He looked at his plate with the expression of a man who has received expected news, and is integrating it with appropriate but not excessive satisfaction. Then he picked up his fork. Good, he said, but it was said with a weight that the single syllable doesn't usually carry. And I understood it to contain within it everything that needed to be said about Edmund Hartwell, and the 63 pages, and the letter timed at 4:47, and the green journal that had been taken from a drawer by a man who had visited at 11:17 p.m., and left at 11:54, and never looked at Edmund Hartwell's sister, at the moment when looking at her would have cost him nothing. Fritz appeared in the doorway with an expression of polite inquiry about whether the interruption had been worth it, and I told him it had, and he nodded with the satisfaction of a man who believes that justice matters, and that a good osso buco is an appropriate medium through which to receive confirmation of it. In the weeks that followed, the architecture of Douglas Crane's undoing assembled itself with the methodical inevitability of a building coming down in slow motion. The district attorney's office, in possession of Foss's written confession, Edmund's 63-page file, the security footage, the financial records, the building entry log, and the medical examiner's revised findings, moved with an efficiency that Kramer told me was unusual, and that I attributed to the quality of the package we had delivered. Douglas Crane was charged with second-degree murder, fraud, forgery, and several ancillary counts that the DA had assembled with the enthusiasm of someone who has been given a very well-organized case and intends to use all of it. He retained counsel, not Foss, who had enough of his own problems, a firm from Midtown with a significant white-collar defense practice, and the kind of hourly rate that explains where Crane had needed his money to go even before his more recent expenditures. The arraignment was brief and procedurally unremarkable. Bail was set and denied on grounds that the prosecution described as flight risk factors, and Kramer described to me, more tersely, as obvious. Gerald Foss surrendered his law license voluntarily, which his attorney presented as evidence of genuine remorse, and which it may also have been. He pleaded guilty to fraud and conspiracy, and received a sentence that took his cooperation into account, in the way that sentences do when cooperation was both substantial and timely. Not nothing, but considerably less than it would have been otherwise. I am not in a position to say whether justice was perfectly served in his case. I can say that Edmund Hartwell's documentation had named him specifically, and that Foss's own decision to come forward, when sitting in Wolfe's red leather chair, with the evidence of his choices arranged before him, had accelerated the resolution of the larger matter in ways that mattered. These things are rarely clean. Charles Reddick and the Meridian Atlantic Holdings situation became, as Wolfe had predicted, a separate investigation for the Financial Crimes Division, which is a specialized world with its own particular rhythms and timeline, and which was therefore several months behind the rest of things by the time I stopped following it closely. Suffice to say that Crane's offshore arrangements had funded a transaction that the relevant authorities found interesting enough to look into at length, and that several people who are not Douglas Crane, but who share his general attitude toward other people's assets, became aware of this interest simultaneously. The fraudulent contract was voided in December. Edmund Hartwell's 40% stake returned to his estate. In January, the estate, administered by Cecilia Hartwell, appointed Peter Ashby as managing director of Hartwell and Crane Publishing, with a 10% equity stake, and a mandate that Cecilia described to me in a brief call as doing what Edmund would have done. The firm published 62 titles the following year, which was one fewer than the year Edmund died, but 3 more than the year before he and Douglas Crane had started it, and which seemed to me to be the appropriate direction of travel. Sylvie Marchand, I learned from Ashby in the spring, had been offered the position of editorial manager, which she'd accepted, and which was, by his account, working out precisely as well as anyone who had spent 40 minutes with her might have expected. Vivian Crane filed for divorce in November, which her attorney processed with the efficiency of someone who has been holding the paperwork at the ready, and was waiting only for the appropriate moment. She sent a brief note to the Brownstone in December, addressed to Wolfe, which is unusual, because most people intuit correctly that the appropriate recipient of social communications is me, that said only, "Thank you for taking him seriously when the police didn't. He deserved it. So did she." The she, I understood, was Cecilia. Wolfe read it, set it on his desk, and said nothing, which is his version of being moved. On a Thursday in late January, almost 3 months after Cecilia Hartwell first sat in the red leather chair, I was at my desk doing the accounts, a task I perform with the resigned professionalism of a man who knows it must be done and has no illusions about enjoying it, when I found myself looking at the letter. We had returned the original to Cecilia after the prosecution had made certified copies, but I had kept a photocopy, filed under H in the cabinet that runs along the east wall of the office, because it seemed important to keep a record of the thing that had started all of it. I had taken it out that morning for no particular reason and left it on the corner of my desk, and now I was looking at it. The handwriting, the old-fashioned capital E with its 3 connected strokes, the H written in a single continuous line. The words chosen with the precision of a man who knew they might need to stand up to scrutiny, and wrote them accordingly. I know what Douglas intends. I have known since August. I have been trying to find a way out of it that does not destroy what we built together. I may have run out of time. He had run out of time. He had also, by the act of writing it down, ensured that running out of time was not the same as losing. He had understood, with the instinct of a man who had spent his professional life knowing which words mattered and which ones didn't, that what he wrote in his own hand and left behind would outlast whatever Douglas Crane planned to do to him. The signature at the bottom of the letter, the sweeping E, the continuous H, the forgotten signature. Not the forged one that had been manufactured in a Park Avenue office on a Thursday afternoon, uploaded under someone else's credentials, and deployed to transfer the life's work of a man who wasn't there to prevent it. That signature had never been Edmund Hartwell's, and it never would be, regardless of what 3 attorneys and a corrupted witness had said about it. This one, the one at the bottom of a letter written in 37 minutes on an October afternoon, by a man who had just been shown what was being done to him, and had responded by writing down the truth in the clearest language available. This was the signature. The real one. The one that had done what all the forgery and fraud and 22 floors of corporate document management had failed to do. It had told the truth about who Edmund Hartwell was, and what he had and had not consented to. And it had kept telling it through 6 weeks of silence, and 11 days of investigation, and 36 hours of laboratory analysis, and whatever came after that. A signature is not a name. It's an assertion. It says, I was here, and I am responsible for what this document says. Edmund Hartwell's signature on that letter asserted exactly that he had been there on that October afternoon, and that he was responsible for the truth it contained, and that the truth would remain the truth, regardless of what Douglas Crane did to the man who had written it. Crane had tried to forget that signature, to render it irrelevant by replacing it with something manufactured, to acquire, by fraud, the thing the real signature represented, the authority and consent of a particular human being whose judgment and dedication had built something worth having. It hadn't worked. In the end, the signature on the letter had been worth considerably more than the signature on the contract, because it was real. And real things have a persistence that manufactured things don't. And Nero Wolfe, who is, when all the eccentricity and beer and orchids and Byzantine culinary history are accounted for, a man with a deep and operational belief in the persistence of truth, had known that from the moment Cecilia Hartwell placed that envelope on his desk. I put the copy back in the cabinet, under H, where it would stay until there was a reason to take it out again. From upstairs came the faint sound of Wolfe moving between the benches in the plant rooms, talking to his orchids in the low, satisfied murmur he uses when a particularly good specimen is doing what he'd hoped it would do. Below, Fritz was beginning whatever lunch was going to be, and the brownstone was warm against the January cold outside, and the accounts were still waiting on my desk with the patient persistence of things that are not interesting but must nevertheless be dealt with. I picked up my pen. Another case would come. They always did. Someone would walk through the front door of the brownstone on West 35th Street, with a manila envelope and a story that didn't add up, and the desperate specific hope that the large man behind the desk, who grew orchids and drank beer, and declined to leave the premises, and found most of humanity simultaneously fascinating and exhausting, could assemble the truth from the pieces they brought him. He would, and I would be at my desk, with my notebook and my pen, and my increasingly complicated relationship with the Tuesday of any given week, ready to go wherever the legwork required, and report back what I'd found, and watch the architecture go up one precisely placed fact at a time. It is not a quiet life. It is not always a safe one. It is, on balance, the best available use of the particular skills I have accumulated over 14 years of being Archie Goodwin, which include an excellent memory, a reliable right cross, the ability to maintain composure in rooms where composure is the most useful thing in them, and the specific professional satisfaction of being present at the moment when the truth, patient, persistent, real, finally catches up to the people who believe they had outrun it. Douglas Crane had believed that. Edmund Hartwell had known better. That, in the end, was the whole of it.